My name is John Holloway. I'm 34 years old, an ex-Marine, and I came to Savage River State Forest in Maryland to get away from civilization, or at least that's what I told myself. If I could go back in time and warn myself what waited in those woods, I would, but I can't. All I can do now is tell you what happened, so maybe someone else will know better than to ever follow my footsteps. This happened last November. I'd been living in a small cabin on the outskirts of Frostburg for about 6 months. My main companion was Boone, my black lab mix. Boone's 5 years old, loyal, well-trained, and honestly the only being I trusted after my last tour of duty overseas. Even before I left the Marines, I never got along with people the way I got along with that dog. So when I decided to do a 2-day hunting trip deep into Savage River State Forest, Boone was right there with me, no questions asked. I had one other person with me, a guy named Ethan Calloway, who was 31. He was from Baltimore, a self-proclaimed survival enthusiast, and he begged me to let him come along. I met him in a local supply store. He recognized my Marine tattoo and asked if I could show him some real outdoor survival skills. I was hesitant, but something in me felt sorry for him. He seemed eager, naive, like someone who'd read too many blog posts on wilderness adventures without ever setting foot off a paved trail. I said yes, against my better judgment. We set off just before a cold snap was due to hit. The plan was to hike in along Monroe Run Trail, then push farther north, where few visitors go. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, November in these woods can get brutally cold. The kind of chill that seeps right into your bones. But I had the right gear, along with my years of training. Ethan, on the other hand, was underprepared from the start, subpar sleeping bag, cheap boots, and a half-broken rifle he insisted was fine. When I tried to warn him, he just said, "I'll manage." Right then, I knew we might have trouble. It didn't take long for the first tension to flare between us. The moment we stepped off the established trail, Ethan started complaining about the cold and the weight of his pack. I told him to toughen up or head back, but he insisted on pressing on. That's when Boone, who usually walked confidently beside me, began to act out of character. He'd stop, sniff the air, let out a low growl, then move on. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he caught the scent of a bear or coyote. Little did I know that was the first sign. My dog could sense something we couldn't. We made camp by dusk, choosing a flat spot near a stream. The wind cut across the water, and the temperature dropped fast as the sun dipped behind the pines. Ethan struggled to get his tent up properly, grumbling at every peg. I set up a simple lean-to for Boone and me. I prefer to sleep under open skies when I can, as long as it's not snowing too bad. I noticed Ethan had this unsettled look in his eyes, like he already regretted coming. But I didn't ask questions. I was here to hunt, teach him some basics, and then see him on his way. He wasn't the only one feeling out of sorts. Even I started getting a strange vibe that night. The forest is usually alive with small noises, wind through leaves, branches creaking, the distant hoot of owls, the rustle of small critters. But around us, it was too quiet. Boone whined at the darkness. I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I prepared our dinner of canned beans and jerky. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. A day later, we ran into Travis Trigg Moore. Trigg was around 40, a local survivalist with a nasty reputation. I'd crossed paths with him once before at a shooting range. He was the type who enjoyed taking pot shots at anything that moved, bragging about kills, and claiming certain tracts of forest were his alone. We spotted him near a game trail, cradling a rifle and wearing a scowl that told us we weren't welcome. "This land ain't yours to hunt," was the first thing he growled when we approached. I told him the forest was state land open to anyone with a license. He spat on the ground and leaned forward. "People disappear out here," he said quietly, his eyes flicking over to Ethan. "If you're not ready for what's in these woods, you won't make it out." Boone bared his teeth. Usually, he's calm around strangers, but Trigg had a vibe that put both of us on edge. Before the tension could escalate, Trigg backed off, melted into the trees, and vanished. Ethan shuddered, like he was relieved Trigg was gone but also terrified. We continued deeper. That night, a sudden blizzard blew in. The temperature plummeted, and snow started layering the forest floor. We hadn't expected the storm to be this bad. Our radio wouldn't pick up any stations, just static, so we had no way of confirming the weather or calling for a forecast. I started to suspect we might be stuck out here longer than planned if the storm didn't let up. Meanwhile, Boone disappeared for 2 hours. 1 minute, he was by the fire. The next, he was gone. I searched the perimeter, calling his name. Eventually, he padded back. But there was something off in the way he moved, like he wasn't comfortable in his own skin. He avoided my gaze. I chalked it up to him being spooked by some scent, or maybe encountering a predator. I told myself I'd keep a closer eye on him. On the third night, Ethan woke me around midnight, panicked. "John, I heard something," he whispered, his eyes wild with fear. He claimed he'd heard his mother's voice calling his name from the darkness. Even though his mother lived hours away in Baltimore. "Go back to sleep," I muttered. I should have listened. I grumbled, half convinced he was just hearing the wind, but the look on his face made me uneasy. "We'll check it out in the morning," I said. Morning came, and we found footprints in the newly fallen snow, circling our camp. They weren't mine, Ethan's, or any that Boone could have made. They were faint, almost identical to our own footprints, but leading away into the dense pines. I had this nagging thought, it looked as though someone had walked in our tracks just after we made them. Exactly in our tracks. Matching each step perfectly. Around noon, we stumbled upon Trigg's campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was ripped to shreds, the sleeping bag torn and scattered. His rifle lay snapped in half, something I'd never seen happen without a serious amount of force. There was no blood, no body, but the entire area reeked of some metallic odor that made the hairs on my neck stand. Boone sniffed the debris and began to whimper, tail between his legs. Whatever hit Trigg's camp, it wasn't a normal animal attack. Ethan started begging me to turn back. "John, this is insane," he said. "We should go." But a part of me wanted to figure this out, or at least verify what happened before leaving. Besides, the storm had made the path almost impassable. Going back immediately wasn't a simple option. We'd need to ration food, pack up slowly, and find a safe route. That evening, the forest closed in with a silence more suffocating than before. I lit a lantern outside the tent, hoping to keep the shadows at bay. Boone lay by my feet, but he still seemed distant, occasionally lifting his head to stare at nothing. Ethan sat across the fire, rifle in his lap, hands shaking. We spoke in hushed tones, neither of us had an appetite. In the flickering firelight, I saw a shape in the distance. At first, I assumed it was my reflection in the dark, my eyes can play tricks in poor light. But then it moved. It waved at me, a slow, deliberate wave. It was shaped like a man, about my height, my build. I shone my flashlight, and it seemed to disappear behind the trunk of a large pine. I decided we were packing up at first light. But that night, chaos broke loose. Ethan snapped awake, shouting something incoherent. I jumped up to see him pointing his rifle at Boone, screaming that my dog's eyes were glowing red. I tried to calm him down, but he turned the gun on me. "Stay back," he shouted. "You're possessed. I see it in your face." He was delirious, maybe from lack of sleep, or hunger, or pure fear. His whole body trembled, and I feared he'd pull the trigger by accident. I inched closer, hands raised. But he fired a shot into the ground at my feet. The bullet kicked up a spray of snow and dirt. Boone barked furiously, and that's when Trigg reappeared. He stepped into our campsite, calm as you please, but his face was wrong. His eyes were wide and vacant, like he wasn't seeing us at all. He didn't even shiver in the cold, which was bitter enough to make my eyes water. Slowly, he put a hand on Ethan's shoulder and whispered something. Ethan's eyes rolled back, and he slumped to the ground. I don't know what came over me, but I lunged at Trigg. Before I could connect, he spun with inhuman speed and knocked me to the ground. My head slammed into a rock, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke, I found myself tied upright to a thick tree trunk. My skin felt wet and raw. I looked down and saw my arms had cuts in them, shallow flays that burned with a searing pain. My clothes were ripped, stuck to my wounds. A rancid smell clogged my nostrils. I glanced around and saw Ethan hanging by ropes from another tree, motionless. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. He wasn't conscious. Maybe he wasn't even alive. My first instinct was to call for Boone. But the only sound I could manage was a broken rasp. Then I saw him. Boone stood at the edge of a small clearing, tail wagging. But his eyes, they weren't his eyes. There was an emptiness there. Like something else was wearing my dog's body. And it spoke. It spoke in Ethan's voice. "John, help me." My blood ran cold. I tried to shut my eyes, to deny what I was seeing. But the nightmare wouldn't vanish. Trig was there too, standing by a makeshift altar. Just a flat stone with odd symbols carved into it. His face was a mask of cruelty. He whispered to me, "The woods take what they want," and chuckled. Then he moved over to Ethan and pressed a knife to his throat. I tried to scream, to break free. But the ropes held tight. My arms ached. My vision blurred. With one swift motion, Trig ended Ethan's life. The body slumped in the ropes, blood soaking the snow. I stared in horror as the forest floor seemed to tremble with some dark energy. Trig looked at me then, tilting his head. "You're next," he said. "Unless you give yourself willingly to the forest." A part of me wanted to faint, to escape the terror. But my training kicked in. I forced my mind to focus on my immediate surroundings. My legs, though tied, had a bit of wiggle room. My left boot had a hidden knife tucked beneath the sole. The problem was, my arms were pinned to my sides, preventing me from reaching it easily. Then, as if the world decided to double down on madness, I heard more footsteps, crunching through the snow. For a moment, I thought rescue had arrived. But stepping into the clearing was me. A second John Holloway, right down to the jacket, the way I hold my shoulders. He stared at me with the same eyes I see in the mirror. Then he smiled, a slow, crooked grin I've never seen on my own face. "I'm you," it whispered, in a voice that scratched at the edges of my sanity. "And you belong to me." I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like sandpaper. Behind my double, I caught sight of Boone, or something that resembled Boone, slowly pacing. The two shapes advanced on me, one wearing my face, the other wearing my dog's. My heart pounded like it was about to burst. Yet in the midst of that, I remembered my knife. Slowly, carefully, I twisted my foot, working the blade free from my boot. The ropes dug into my torn arms, making me gasp in pain, but I kept going. Finally, I felt the handle slip into reach. I slid the blade free, clasped it between my fingers, and started sawing the rope. Trig raised his hand as though signaling my copies to stand down. Then he approached me. His breath was hot against my face, smelling of copper and decay. "It's the forest, John," he hissed. "This place has always been hungry. It's just wearing my face. Your face. Whatever it wants." I focused on the rope, ignoring his words. Another few seconds, and the fibers snapped. My arm shot free, grabbing at Trig's wrist. He was strong, unnaturally so, and he laughed as I struggled. But I had adrenaline on my side, and a lifetime of training telling me not to give up. With one desperate motion, I yanked him forward and drove the knife into his chest. The laughter died in his throat as he staggered back, eyes wide. The world seemed to hold its breath. Trig collapsed onto his back in the snow, blood staining the ground dark red. But there was no gurgling, no final words. He just stared at me, unmoving. Then he started to grin, even with a blade in his chest. "You can't kill what's already dead," he rasped. I looked to my right. The thing wearing my face started advancing. So did the thing wearing Boone's body. It was now or never. I used Trig's body as leverage to steady myself and tore away the rest of my bindings. I grabbed Ethan's rifle from the altar. It was battered, but hopefully still usable, and turned to face the illusions. Except they weren't illusions. They moved in unison, closing in. With no time to aim properly, I fired off a shot. The recoil nearly knocked me over in my weakened state. My doppelganger jerked to the side, letting out a shriek that sounded like metal scraping across stone. The shape in Boone's body snarled. I fired again, ignoring the tears that burned my eyes as I aimed at something that looked like my dog. A horrific yelp tore through the night, and I saw it collapse into the snow. Boom! I screamed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't really him. When the echoes finally died, I scanned the clearing. Trig's body was gone. Only blood spatter remained. So was the doppelganger. The only sign of Boone's imitation was a dark patch on the ground, like tar seeping into the snow. I made myself move. I knew if I stopped, I'd lose my mind. Or bleed out. Or freeze first. I went to Ethan. He was gone. Eyes vacant. No pulse. His face contorted in silent horror. I wanted to close his eyes, but I was shaking so hard it took me 3 tries to do it. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He had come here to learn from me, and all I'd done was lead him into a nightmare. I stumbled away from the clearing. My only thought was to get out, to reach any sign of civilization. My arms stung with every movement, the cuts seeping blood. It was painfully slow, but I forced myself forward through the storm. The wind picked up, biting my face. The smell of iron and decay clung to my nostrils. As dawn approached, I realized I was walking in circles. The forest wasn't letting me leave. I was about to panic when a new plan formed in my mind. I had to destroy whatever was in here. Maybe it was a desperate, suicidal idea, but I had no illusions that simply leaving was an option. If this thing was real, if it took Trig, Ethan, even my dog, then I had to eliminate it. I still had some supplies, including a small canister of stove fuel, plus a lighter. The forest was full of tinder, dead leaves, pine needles, plenty to start a blaze. Normally, I would never burn public land. But this wasn't normal. I went to my base camp, where we'd left a stash of supplies. My eyes darted constantly, searching the trees for movement. But the forest felt empty. Too empty. Once at camp, I poured every last drop of accelerant I had into a circle of pines, making a perimeter. Then, I lit it. The flames caught quickly, fueled by dead branches and the needle-laden ground. Within minutes, bright orange walls danced around me, sending smoke high into the sky. I heard screaming. Or maybe it was the wind. The fire roared around me. I stumbled through the inferno, the heat singing my eyebrows. For a second, I thought I saw Boone in a gap between the trees. He looked normal, tail wagging. He barked once, as if calling to me. Tears streamed down my face, burning from the smoke as I ran toward him. But the figure melted into the flames. The fire spread faster than I expected. A gust of wind whipped the blaze in a new direction, and soon, the inferno was out of my control. Trees groaned. Branches popped. Smoke choked the sky, blotting out the sun. Through the haze, I pushed forward, heading east. I knew there was a service road if I just kept moving. I stumbled. Crawled. My lungs raw from smoke inhalation. Then, a pair of headlights cut through the swirling ash. A county SUV rolled to a stop. Sheriff Carl DeWitt stepped out, covering his mouth with a bandana. I'd seen him around once or twice. He stared at me, horrified, and called for backup on his radio. I collapsed at his feet. When I came to, I was in the back of an ambulance. My arms were bandaged. My head pounded. Outside, Sheriff DeWitt stood talking quietly with a man in a suit. FBI, from the look of him. I strained to hear them. And the cause of the fire, the man asked. The sheriff shrugged. Just a camper accident. But they both looked on edge, like they were hiding something bigger than a wildfire. A paramedic leaned over me. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. I swallowed hard. "What about Ethan? My dog?" She shook her head. No one else was found. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The FBI declared the area unsafe. Sent in a crew to contain the blaze. It's quarantined now. Don't worry, we'll take care of it. That's when I realized. They weren't going to investigate the strange footprints. Or the doppelganger in the woods. They weren't going to look for Ethan's body. They were going to bury this whole thing. Maybe they already knew what lurked in Savage River State Forest. Maybe they'd known for a long time. But they weren't going to tell me. or anyone else. They took me to a hospital in Cumberland, where I spent days recovering. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. Sedatives, PTSD, exposure, shock. That's what they called it. The official record states that Ethan wandered off in the storm, that we got separated, that I lost track of him. It states there was a tragic wildfire, likely sparked by an unattended campfire in high winds. When I was discharged, Sheriff DeWitt gave me a warning. Don't go stirring up rumors, he said. Wouldn't want to cause any undue panic. I wanted to punch him, but I was too weak. I just stared. He nodded, as if satisfied I understood. And I did. He was telling me, in no uncertain terms, to keep my mouth shut. A few days later, I returned to my cabin in Frostburg. The nightmares started immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's body swinging from that rope. Trig's lifeless gaze locked on me. Or worse, a twisted version of Boone, beckoning me deeper into the forest. For weeks, I barely slept. Then, one morning, I found a small package on my front porch. No return addresses. Inside was a single object. Ethan's dog tag. It was scorched, as if it had been through a fire. I'd never known Ethan to wear a dog tag. He wasn't military. Yet there it was, his name, an outdated phone number inscribed on the metal. My hands shook as I turned it over. My heart pounded. That night, I heard scratching at my door. I grabbed my rifle. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I found paw prints in the fresh snow. They led in a circle, ending abruptly in the middle of the yard, as if whatever made them had just vanished. The size of the prints matched Boone's. Exactly. I don't know if I'll ever see my real dog again, or if he died back in that clearing, or if something else is wearing his shape. Even now, sometimes, I catch movement in the woods near my cabin. A flicker of a tail. A silhouette that looks so heartbreakingly familiar. But I can't be sure. All I know is, I tried to fight back against the darkness in that forest. And I failed. The official story? A wildfire. Reckless camping. But I can still hear the whispers at night. Scratching at my sanity. Calling me to go back. Calling me, by my own voice. From somewhere deep in Savage River State Forest. If you ever find yourself in Maryland, anywhere near those cold, silent trees, heed my warning. Turn around. Go home. There's something old and hungry out there, wearing the faces of the dead, or the living. You won't see it coming until it's too late. And even if you escape, you'll never really be free. I'm living proof of that. Though sometimes, I wonder, if the man who left those woods is the same one who entered. Because every time I look in the mirror, I question if the reflection looking back at me is really mine, or just something that learned how to wear my face. I wanted solitude, peace, maybe a shot at living life on my own terms, far away from city noise and corporate greed. So, I bought a small tract of land, 6 acres of dense swamp and forest, a rickety old cabin that was barely standing. The real estate agent, Rick Donovan, had been oddly eager to close the deal, practically shoving the papers at me, refusing to negotiate the price. At the time, I was just relieved that someone was willing to sell it at all. Most people in town gave me strange looks when I mentioned my plans to move into the swamp. Some warned me. Legends, curses, devils, ghosts, rumors. I laughed it off. After all, I was a man of facts. Or at least, I used to be. When I arrived at the cabin with my meager belongings, I noticed a few unsettling details right away. Old animal traps, rusted beyond recognition, were scattered around the property. Piles of bones, small, maybe raccoon or possum, lay near the edge of the clearing. Even stranger, I found crooked symbols carved into the cypress trees. Circles with crosses. Triangles with eyes. Runes I didn't recognize. I shrugged it off. Superstition. Locals probably did it to scare folks like me. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time patching holes in the roof, clearing fallen branches, and trying to stabilize the porch, which felt like it might collapse at any moment. But on the third night, as I lay on my battered cot inside, I heard it. 3 knocks at the door. Soft. Measured. 1, 2, 3. I bolted upright, adrenaline pouring through me. I grabbed my flashlight and the hunting knife I kept by my side. When I opened the door, no one was there. The clearing was silent, except for the rustling wind and the buzz of insects. Maybe a branch had fallen against the cabin, I reasoned. I circled around with my flashlight, searching for signs of trespassers. Nothing. It wasn't unusual to hear random thumps in a place as thickly wooded as Blackwater. But the next night, I heard the same 3 knocks again. Louder this time. I jumped to my feet and yanked the door open immediately, and nearly dropped my flashlight. There were footprints in the mud, leading up to my door, but none going away. I tried not to panic. I was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor. The few folks I'd seen in town had been polite but distant. Rick had told me the place was quiet, that I'd be free to do as I pleased. Now, though, an uneasy feeling clung to me. Something was off. The third time the knocking came, it was midday, and that's when I saw the man in the black suit. I'd been outside, checking the perimeter, when I spotted him at the edge of the clearing. Tall, standing unnaturally still, wearing a perfectly pressed suit and holding a black fedora in one hand. He looked like he'd stepped out of a funeral from the 1950s. My heart thudded in my chest, but I forced myself to approach. "Hello," I called. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me. Then, he smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. I remember noticing his eyes didn't seem to reflect the sunlight. "This land," he said softly, "belongs to someone else." "Funny," I said, my voice shaking a bit. "I have the deed." His smile widened. "Still cold." "Deeds can be deceiving," he replied. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the swamp. I stood there, stunned, until he vanished among the cypress trees. I debated driving into town to ask Rick what was going on. Was there some kind of boundary dispute? But I stayed. Pride, maybe. Or plain stubbornness. This was my land now, and I wasn't going to be scared off by weird knocks or spooky strangers. That evening, while I was checking the generator behind the cabin, a woman burst out of the brush. She collapsed at my feet. She was maybe in her late 20s. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn. When she saw me, her eyes widened with fear. But she was too exhausted to crawl away. I helped her inside, gave her water. After she caught her breath, she told me her name. Grace Mitchell. She'd been on the run, hiding in the swamp after witnessing a crime. She refused to specify at first, but I pressed her gently. Finally, she spoke. She had seen local thugs, kidnapping people, trafficking them. She had seen the man in charge, a sheriff. At that, my pulse kicked up. Sheriff Duncan Briggs, respected by the community. She was claiming he was involved in human trafficking. It sounded insane, but the bruises on her arms were real, and the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. "We need to get to the authorities," I said. She shook her head. "They are the authorities." "Ironic, isn't it?" I muttered. Grace shook her head. "If the sheriff is in on it, who can we trust?" She was right. The nearest police station was under Briggs' jurisdiction. Going there might be handing ourselves over to the very people she feared. Still, I couldn't just hide her in my dilapidated cabin forever. That night, Rick Donovan showed up. I was surprised to see him. He'd never mentioned visiting. In fact, I'd called him a few times after the man in the black suit appeared, but he hadn't returned my calls. Now, suddenly, he was here, smiling, acting all neighborly. He wore a casual flannel shirt and jeans, said he'd dropped by to check on me. I introduced him to Grace. He nodded politely, but I noticed how his eyes flicked over her bruises. Something about his presence put me on edge. He insisted on staying for dinner. I put a few cans of soup on the stove. As we ate, Rick tried to coax Grace into revealing why she was there. She avoided the question. Said she just needed a place to lay low. His tone shifted, becoming almost fatherly. "You should come back with me to town," he said. I felt her tense up. The longer he spoke, the more uneasy I felt. After dinner, he got up to leave. But as he stood in the doorway, he leaned in close. "You sure you know who you're harboring?" he whispered. His voice was quiet, almost concerned. "I can help. Let me know if you need anything." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. Once he was gone, Grace let out a shaky breath. "I've seen him before," she whispered. I can't place where." Panic flickered in her eyes. I assured her she was safe. That assurance didn't last long. That night, we made a plan. At dawn, we'd leave. Drive straight to Baltimore. Bypass local authorities altogether. But around midnight, an engine rumbled outside. No, not one, two, maybe three. Headlights beamed through the trees. Men, masks, guns. My stomach twisted. "Grace, wake up," I whispered urgently. We armed ourselves, me with a hunting knife, her with an old shotgun I kept for wildlife. But these men, they weren't animals. They came in fast. The door crashed open. A man grabbed Grace. Another slammed the butt of a rifle into my gut. Pain exploded through me. I doubled over, gasping. I heard Grace scream. Saw her dragged outside. Everything blurred. I remember the floor, choking on my own spit. A heavy boot stomped on my back. Then, through the haze, Rick Donovan, standing in the doorway. No mask, just a sad smile. Then, darkness. I woke with a throbbing headache. Wrists bound, tied to a chair. My mouth was dry. My ribs ached. A single light bulb swayed above me, casting nauseating shadows. The room smelled of damp wood and rust. In the corner, a rack of tools. Hammers, wrenches, not for fixing things. My stomach twisted. The door creaked open. Sheriff Duncan Briggs stepped inside. I recognized him from the wanted posters Grace had described. Tall, broad-shouldered, a thick mustache that should have made him look trustworthy. Instead, he looked like a snake. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he said calmly. His arms crossed over his chest. "We prefer folks mind their own business here in Blackwater." I spat at his feet. He ignored it. "As far as the county is concerned, you never showed up. You bought land. You disappeared. End of story." My hands strained against the ropes. "Where's Grace?" I growled. Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Who?" I cursed again, louder this time. He stepped forward and drove his fist into my jaw. White-hot pain flashed through my skull. Darkness threatened to take me again, but I held on. Through the haze, I heard him mutter something about keeping quiet. Then he left. I sat there for what felt like hours, testing the ropes, twisting my wrists. Pain flared. Then, an idea. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and dislocated my thumb. Agony shot up my arm. I bit down hard to keep from screaming, but it worked. The rope loosened. I was free. And now, it was my turn. I bit down to keep from screaming and managed to free my other hand. My ankles weren't bound, so I stumbled to the corner, legs trembling, adrenaline draining fast. Still, I reached for a hammer and gripped it like my life depended on it, because it did. Minutes passed. Then the door creaked open. A guard, one of Briggs' men, stepped inside, probably to check on me. I swung the hammer wildly. It caught him on the side of the head with a sickening crack. He crumpled, blood spilling onto the floor. I gagged, but survival instincts took over. I tore the pistol from his belt and bolted for the door. Outside, the night was thick with swamp air. A single pickup truck sat in the middle of a muddy clearing. No other guards in sight. I didn't dare linger. I staggered into the swamp, half crazed with fear and pain, cradling my dislocated thumb. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. Knee-high water dragged at my legs. Mosquitoes swarmed. Night creatures stirred. Somewhere behind me, footsteps. Or maybe just the swamp playing tricks. Occasionally, I caught a flicker of movement, a shadow at the edge of my vision. Each time I turned, it vanished. Finally, I reached dry land. Ahead, looming in the darkness, was the skeletal remains of an old church, rotted wood, shattered stained glass. I had no choice. I crept inside. Pews lay overturned. The altar was half collapsed. A thick, musty odor of mold and decay clung to the air. And then I saw him. The man in black. Sitting where the pulpit once stood, leaning against a worn lectern. That same immaculate suit. His hat resting on his knee. He greeted me with a nod, like we were old friends meeting by chance. "You look terrible," he said softly. I raised the pistol, though my hands were shaking so badly I doubted I could hit him. "What do you want from me?" He smiled and stepped closer. "I don't want anything, Ethan. I'm here to offer you something." "Who are you?" My voice barely came out. He tilted his head, as if considering how to answer. "Some call me an opportunity. Others call me a curse." He smiled faintly. "A few know me by a simpler name." The pause stretched. Then, the devil. The word settled like a weight in my chest. I wanted to laugh, to scoff at the absurdity. But suddenly, the air was colder. The shadows in the ruined church seemed to stretch, curling around the edges of my vision. Some primal part of me screamed that this was no ordinary man. "You want grace," I said, though I wasn't even sure if that was true. His eyes darkened. "I want many things," he murmured. "But right now, I'm here to give you a choice." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "You can leave this place," he continued. "Forget grace. Forget these men and their crimes. Live your life. Or," he extended the parchment toward me, "you can sign, and I'll grant you the power to save her." I wanted to run, to say no. But images of Grace, bruised, broken, bleeding, flashed in my mind. I could feel myself teetering on the edge of something I couldn't name. But then, a memory of the stories I'd written, the truths I'd uncovered. If I took a deal from this thing, I'd be no better than the criminals I once exposed. I shook my head. "No." He sighed, almost disappointed. "You'll beg soon enough." He stepped aside. And that's when Rick Donovan walked in. He emerged from behind the shattered altar, grinning. Something about him was off. The way the shadows clung to him. The way he seemed taller, broader, like he barely fit inside his own skin. "You," I snarled, aiming the pistol. "You set me up." Rick smirked. "I warned you, Ethan," he said, voice mocking. "Tried to help you understand. The swamp doesn't belong to you." He nodded toward the man in black. "It belongs to him." I snapped. I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the rotted rafters. Rick staggered back. A neat, smoking hole in his chest. Blood dripped. But he barely seemed bothered. Then, he lunged. Unnatural speed. A blur of motion. The pistol flew from my grip as he slammed into me. We crashed into the pews. Splintered wood tore at my arms. He was on top of me, his face twisted into a cruel sneer. I punched him hard right in the throat. Something snapped. But he just laughed. Then he grabbed the back of my head and slammed it into the floor. Stars exploded behind my eyes. My vision swam. Through the haze, I heard the man in black chuckle, watching like we were some kind of entertainment. Rick dragged me to my feet. My fingers brushed something. The pistol. Still jammed between the broken boards. I gripped it. Pressed it under Rick's jaw. Pulled the trigger. Twice. Blood and brain matter sprayed across the altar. Rick collapsed. Twitching. Then, nothing. I staggered back, shaking. Trying not to vomit. When I looked up, the man in black was still there. Calm. Unconcerned. "Only one of you gets to leave," he murmured. I half expected Rick to rise again. But he didn't. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the warped floorboards. I turned, breathing hard. Then, a voice. "Ethan." I spun. Grace stood in the broken doorway. Tears streaked her bruised face. She was alive. Relief crashed over me, until I saw her eyes. Dark. Too dark. Almost black. She staggered forward. Something was wrong. Grace, I said softly, reaching out. Grace, are you okay? She opened her mouth as if to speak, but her lips curled into a half sneer. You should have taken the deal, she whispered. The voice wasn't hers. Then she lunged. A knife flashed in her hand. I barely dodged the first swing, but the second plunged deep into my shoulder. Pain exploded through me, ripping a scream from my throat. I grabbed at her wrist, desperate to restrain her, but she was impossibly strong. The mania in her eyes told me she wasn't in control. You have to fight it, I pleaded, though I wasn't sure she could even hear me. The blade twisted deeper. I gasped. My knees buckled. Black spots clouded my vision. Any second now, I'd collapse. Somehow, I managed to swing the butt of the pistol against her temple. She stumbled backward, dazed. It was enough. With a strangled cry, I yanked the knife from my shoulder, blood spilling hot down my arm, making my grip slick. She came at me again. I had no choice. I slammed my head into hers. A desperate, final move. She crumpled to the ground, stunned. I staggered back, chest heaving. When I looked up, the man in black was gone. No trace of him. My whole body trembled, partly from blood loss, partly from horror. I crawled toward Grace, ignoring the throbbing in my shoulder. I reached for her face, brushing damp strands of hair aside. You can't be gone, I murmured. Her eyes fluttered open. For a split second, I saw her. The real Grace. Terror flickered across her face. She parted her lips, maybe to say my name. Then she screamed. A raw, inhuman sound. Before I could react, she spun away, scrambling on all fours like some wild beast. I cried out. But she vanished into the swamp. Into the dark. I don't remember how I made it back to the road. Everything after that fight was a fevered blur, pain, stumbling, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Then, headlights. I collapsed, fully expecting to be run over or shot. But instead, voices. He's alive. Two men rushed out, their silhouettes framed by blinding beams. FBI agents. Or so they claimed. I never got their names. They loaded me into a black SUV, gave me some rough first aid, then started driving. I babbled incoherently about Rick, Grace, the sheriff, him, the man in black. They listened in silence. The fever was taking me, but I managed to ask, why is the FBI here? Middle of nowhere. One of them exchanged a glance with the other. We got a tip about illegal activity. That's all you need to know. Then, blackness. When I came to, the SUV had stopped. I blinked sluggishly at the windshield. Smoke curled into the night sky. Flames licked the remains of a building. My cabin. I tried to sit up, but the pain pinned me. What's happening? I rasped. The other agent turned, his expression unreadable. Evidence disposal. I stared. We don't need this drawing attention, he added, voice even. The words didn't sink in at first. Then the truth hit me like a hammer. My home, everything I owned, burning to the ground. Gone. I twisted toward them, throat tightening. Grace. She was never here. The first agent's voice cut through the haze. And you were never in Blackwater. Understand? My heart pounded. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers. But fear kept my mouth shut. These weren't heroes. They weren't here to clean up corruption. They were here to bury it. Like they'd bury the sheriff. The kidnappings. The devil in the black suit. No official record would survive. A wad of gauze was shoved into my hand. For your shoulder. Then, the door opened. I was pushed out. I hit the pavement, barely catching myself on my hands. Weak. Bleeding. One of them leaned out. We'll give you a head start. A pause. But if you speak about this, you won't like what happens. Then they drove off, leaving me alone in the darkness. I turned, watching the flames devour my cabin. Smoke twisted toward the starless sky. My eyes burned. And I realized I had nowhere to go. No one to trust. I wish I could say I found closure. That I recovered. That I brought the corrupt sheriff to justice. But that isn't how this story ends. I made it to a hospital. The staff patched me up. Asked a few polite questions. I lied. Spun some tale about an accident in the woods. They didn't press. I left Maryland as soon as I could walk without falling over. Found a cheap motel in Virginia. And sat there. Alone. Thinking about Grace. Wondering if she was still alive out there. Or if something worse had claimed her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The black hollows where hers used to be. A month later. A shabby bar off the interstate. I was nursing a whiskey, trying to drown the memories. Then, a presence. I felt it before I saw him. My skin prickled. I turned. And there he was. Same suit. Same fedora. The man in black. Smiling. A drink in his hand. Like he'd been waiting all along. He tipped the brim of his hat with a small, polite nod. Then he smiled. That same cold, knowing smile. And then, he vanished. No door opened. No footsteps receded. He was just gone. I froze, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. It was confirmation of what I had dreaded all along. I would never truly escape. Whatever he was, devil, demon, or something worse, I was marked. A man doesn't walk away from a bargain with the devil, even if he never signs the contract. I paid my tab and hurried outside, scanning the parking lot, half expecting to see him leaning against a car, watching. Instead, there was only darkness. A sliver of moonlight on the asphalt. The sound of my own ragged breathing. I climbed into my battered sedan and started the engine. I didn't know where I was going. Only that I needed to keep driving. Since that night, I've stayed on the move, never lingering in one place too long. The nightmares haven't stopped. On bad nights, I dream of Grace screaming in that old church, her black eyes staring through me. I dream of Rick's corpse rising from the floor, grinning. And sometimes, I hear knocks on motel doors. Always 3. When I open up, there's no one there. But footprints remain. Leading up to the door. Never away. Wherever I go, I sense that presence. That quiet, patient threat. I know one thing for certain. I refused the deal. But I haven't won. I'm just a loose end. Waiting to be tied up. Or maybe I'm a future mark, waiting for the next time the man in black decides to offer me a choice. And if it ever happens again, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to refuse him a second time. That's my story. I survived. But not in any way you'd call living. So if you ever find yourself alone in the Blackwater swamp, or anywhere that feels ancient and hungry, listen for those knocks. Watch for footprints that appear out of nowhere. And if a tall stranger in a black suit offers you a deal, run. Because once you've let the devil into your life, he never really leaves. And if you're reading this, thinking it's all nonsense, just the paranoid ramblings of a drifter, be glad you can afford to doubt. I envy your innocence. I'd give anything to have it back. But there's no going back. Once you've seen the darkness in those eyes, you can only run. And pray he doesn't follow. Story 3. My name is Emily C. I'm 29 years old. This happened last fall. On Assateague Island, Maryland. I've tried to forget it every day since. But the nightmares always bring me back. Maybe if I write it down, it'll make sense. Or at least let me sleep. I had planned the trip to Assateague as a way to reconnect with my boyfriend, Dan Brooks, who's 31. We'd been drifting apart after a rough few months. My best friend, Lisa Vance, 28, heard about it and asked if she and her boyfriend, Kyle Henson, 32, could tag along. In retrospect, I wish I'd said no. But I felt guilty about wanting time alone. Lisa had been there for me through so much. So I said yes. 4 people. 1 stretch of beach. A weekend to clear our minds. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in Lisa's SUV, stuffed with camping gear, coolers, and way too many snacks. The sky was overcast, the steady ocean breeze carrying the tang of salt. Assateague was known for wild horses, shifting sands, and the kind of isolation you don't find in a typical tourist spot. We were heading for a remote campsite, far from the more popular beaches. We passed a few other campers on the main road, but once we turned onto a sandy trail, we didn't see another soul. "I can't believe how quiet it is," Lisa said, leaning out the passenger window, her ponytail whipping in the wind. "No cars, no horns. She gestured. Just waves." Kyle rummaged through the back. "I found the beer," he said, grinning. "Let's have one before we set up." Dan glanced at me. "We should at least get the tents up first," he said. "Sun goes down in a few hours." I agreed. To my relief, Lisa and Kyle let the beer idea go. The short drive to the campsite felt longer. The dunes shifted unpredictably, the SUV's tires skidding more than once. We almost got stuck. Twice. When we finally stopped, we were surrounded by beach grass and twisted pine trees. The ocean was just over a small dune to the east, the sound of waves faint but constant. Dan and I started setting up our tent right away. Lisa and Kyle joined in, though Kyle kept joking about how he couldn't wait to crack open a cold one and just zone out. The wind picked up as evening approached, carrying a cool dampness that settled into my bones. By the time we finished pitching our tents, a heavy feeling pressed on my chest. Not quite dread, but a nagging unease. We built a small fire near the dune, using driftwood and some logs we'd brought. As dusk settled, the local wildlife began to stir. A pair of wild horses trotted along the beach in the distance, their silhouettes black against the orange sky. They stopped at one point, turned their heads in our direction. I'm sure it was just curiosity, but something about their stillness struck me as wrong. They didn't move. They didn't even twitch. Just stood there, watching. The firelight flickered in their dark eyes. My heart fluttered. "I don't like that," Lisa whispered. "They're kind of creeping me out." Dan poked at the fire. "Probably just not used to seeing people out here," he said. "Relax." I tried, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones watching. I wanted to agree with him. I really did. But the horses wouldn't move. They just stood there, rigid as statues, their dark eyes locked on us. Eventually, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the horses disappeared into the night. We spent the next hour talking and laughing around the fire. Kyle finally got his beer. Lisa cracked open a bottle of wine. The tension in my shoulders loosened a little. Maybe my unease was just nerves, nothing more than the excitement of the trip. But that quiet sense of alarm never really left me. It was around 10 p.m. when Lisa excused herself to walk down the beach. Dan and Kyle were deep in conversation, swapping stories from Dan's time in the Marines. I stared into the fire, lost in thought, until Lisa called my name. "Emily, come look at this." Her voice carried over the wind. I hesitated, then followed the sound over a ridge of sand. "What is it?" I called. She was crouched near the water's edge, her flashlight beam sweeping the wet sand. I stepped closer, then stopped cold. Footprints. Small. Barefoot. Maybe the size of a 6 or 7-year-old child. But something was off. The impressions were oddly deep, as if whoever made them was far heavier than they should have been. The tracks led away from the water, then disappeared into the dunes. "That's weird," I said, pulse quickening. "The nearest campsite is probably a mile away." Lisa shrugged. "I saw them glinting when the wave receded." She lifted her flashlight, scanning the dark beach. "Maybe there's a family around. But wouldn't we hear them?" We returned to the fire, unsettled but trying to brush it off. Kyle joked that maybe the wild horses had started walking upright. No one laughed. By the time we turned in for the night, it was well past midnight. Dan and I lay in our tent, the steady crash of the ocean lulling us. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A whimper. Soft. Faint. Like a child crying. I sat up, heart pounding. "Dan, you hear that?" He stirred beside me. Listened. Silence. "Probably the wind," he mumbled. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The sound came again. A little louder this time. Coming from the dunes. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a cold dread settled in my stomach. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Eventually, exhaustion won. I woke at dawn. Alone. Dan was gone. I crawled out of the tent, the morning light casting a pale, hazy glow. Lisa and Kyle stood by a small driftwood fire, sipping coffee. Dan was nowhere in sight. "Where's Dan?" I asked, rubbing sleep from my eyes. Kyle gestured toward the trees. "Went for water. The cooler's half empty. He took the canteens." I frowned. "Alone?" Lisa must have seen the worry in my face. "Don't freak out. He said there's a freshwater spigot near the park sign. He'll be back soon." I wasn't convinced. An uneasy hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Still no Dan. We were debating whether to go looking for him when he finally returned, looking annoyed. "Water's a bust," he said, setting the empty canteens down. "Spigot's busted or something." He dropped into a beach chair. His hands were shaking. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. "Just weird." The spigot was intact, but no water. And I swear, I heard footsteps behind me the whole time. Lisa and Kyle exchanged glances. None of us spoke, but I could feel it. We were all thinking the same thing. The footprints on the beach. The whimper in the night. Dan's uneasy morning trek. Something was wrong. The tension lingered all day. We explored the beach, hoping to find another campsite. Maybe even other people. But we saw no one. Just the wild horses, distant silhouettes galloping across the sand. No structures. No boats. Nothing. By late afternoon, we were back at camp, restless and on edge. Carl started drinking again. He wasn't drunk, but he was louder now. More careless with his words. Lisa suggested we gather driftwood for the fire. Dan and Kyle went north. Lisa and I went south. The wind had picked up, stinging our eyes with salt and sand. The tide was receding, leaving behind a stretch of wet sand that shimmered under the grey sky. That's when we saw her, a little girl, standing alone near the shore. She wore shorts and a faded pink t-shirt. Her dark hair hung limp, half covering her face. Barefoot. Too small to be out here alone. She looked 6 or 7. The same age that would match the footprints. Lisa reacted first. "Hey," she called, rushing forward. "Are you okay?" The girl turned. Slowly. Her wide eyes shimmered with terror. Her skin was pale. Too pale. And then, she started sobbing. "I can't find my mommy," she said in a trembling voice. Tears streaked her pale cheeks. I looked around. Nothing but endless sand, the dark ocean stretching beyond. "Are you camping here?" I asked. She nodded. But when we pressed for details, where her tent was, her parents' names, her answers didn't add up. She pointed toward the ocean. "Over there." Lisa and I exchanged a glance. The tide had rolled back, leaving smooth, undisturbed sand. No footprints. No tents. And her clothes, perfectly dry. Not a speck of sand clung to her bare feet. My gut twisted. Lisa, more sympathetic than me, took the girl's hand. "We'll help you," she said gently. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "Claire," she whispered. I knelt down. "Claire, were you with anyone else? Brothers? Sisters?" She shook her head. But she didn't meet my eyes. The way she blinked, slow, deliberate, made my skin crawl. Like a doll mimicking human expressions. We led her back to camp, calling for Dan and Kyle along the way. By the time we arrived, they were already building up the fire. Dan's surprise at seeing a lost child quickly shifted to concern. But there was a problem. None of us had a working phone. No service this far out. Our only plan was to wait until morning and drive her to the ranger station. Dan knelt beside her, offering a granola bar. Claire stared at it. Then at him. She hesitated. Not like a child unsure about food. Like someone unfamiliar with the concept of eating. Then, finally, she bit into it. Chewed. slowly, and never once looked away from Dan's face. Night fell quickly. The wind howled, rattling the tents. The horses never returned. I almost wished they had. Anything to feel less alone. Claire sat by the fire, small hands folded in her lap, staring into the flames. Then I noticed it. She never shivered. Not once. Despite the cold, damp air. I tried talking to her again, but her answers were vague. Lisa, ever the caretaker, offered to share her tent. But Claire refused. I want to stay by the fire. I didn't like the idea of her being alone. So I set up a second sleeping bag near her, within view of our tent. At least I could keep an eye on her. Kyle shrugged at the arrangement. Probably safer than letting a strange kid into personal space, he muttered. Lisa scolded him for being insensitive. Sometime in the night, I woke with a jolt. I hadn't even remembered falling asleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, flickering glow over the camp. My head throbbed. I scanned the area, heart pounding. Dan, still asleep in our tent. Lisa's tent zipped shut. Kyle, his hammock was still. Claire. She was gone. I spotted her standing at the water's edge. Motionless. Facing the ocean. Barefoot in the freezing sand. A wave of unease rolled over me. I scrambled out of the tent. Claire, I called softly. She turned. The wind swept her hair across her face. But the way she moved. Too smooth. Too unnatural. My pulse slammed in my ears. I hesitated. For the first time, I was afraid to get too close. But I had to. She was just a child, right? Come back, I said, my voice unsteady. It's not safe out there. She stepped toward me. The moonlight hit her face. And my stomach dropped. Her eyes. They weren't reflecting light. Just bottomless pools of black. Emily, she whispered. You're mine now. I staggered back. How do you know my name? Her lips parted in a small smile. Dan told me. My blood turned to ice. That wasn't possible. Dan had barely spoken to her. A wave of nausea hit me. I opened my mouth. But Claire lifted a hand and pointed behind me. Don't you want to check on Dan? Something in her voice made my skin prickle. I spun toward the tents. And then, Lisa's scream. I ran, nearly tripping over the dying fire. Lisa's tent. The flap was ripped open. Inside, empty. No Lisa. No sleeping bags. Just drag marks in the sand. Leading toward the dunes. Lisa, I screamed. Dan stumbled out of our tent, flashlight in hand, eyes wide. What the where's Lisa? Then we noticed. Kyle's hammock. It was overturned. The netting shredded. Kyle was gone. The drag marks continued into the dunes. The same direction. Dan and I bolted after them, breath ragged, fear clawing at our throats. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, casting erratic shadows over the sand. Then, we saw him. Kyle. Lying face down in the dirt. Motionless. But breathing. We rushed to him. Dan rolled him over. Kyle's eyes were open. Staring blindly at the sky. Lips moving. Whispering something we couldn't understand. Kyle, Dan barked, shaking him. Where's Lisa? No response. His mouth twitched. Formed gibberish words. Then, with a sudden, violent burst of strength, Kyle lunged. His hands clamped around Dan's throat. Dan gasped, struggling. I grabbed at Kyle's wrists, prying at his fingers. But the look on his face. Rage. And something else. Something empty. Like he wasn't there anymore. Like something else had taken over. And then, he whispered. In Claire's voice. You're mine now. I screamed. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed a chunk of driftwood and swung. Hard. The impact sent a sickening crack through the night. Kyle crumpled. Dan fell back, coughing, gasping for air. I shone the flashlight over Kyle's motionless body. Blood trickled from his temple. He was breathing, but we had never seen him like this. Dan's voice shook. He's possessed, or on something. That's not normal. Then, another scream tore through the dunes. High-pitched. Agonizing. Lisa. I bolted forward, ignoring Dan's frantic shouts for me to stop. The flashlight bounced wildly, barely illuminating the uneven sand. Strange marks gouged the ground. Deep. Like claw marks. Lisa's screams guided me through the dunes. Until I found her. Pinned. Trapped against the base of a collapsed dune. Her arms wrenched back at an unnatural angle. And looming over her. Claire. Or whatever thing she really was. Her hair whipped in the wind, face hidden. Then she spoke. But the voice that came out. It wasn't a child's. It was ancient. A guttural, inhuman growl. You will stay. I froze. My mind screamed that this was a nightmare. That this wasn't real. Lisa's eyes locked onto mine. Desperate. Tear-streaked. Blood smeared her face. Dan caught up just as I broke out of my stupor. With a furious shout, he charged. But Claire. She barely moved. A single swipe of her hand sent him flying. Dan hit the ground hard. Lisa tried to scramble away, but Claire's fingers clamped around her ankle. Yanked her back. Lisa shrieked. I lunged. Jumped onto Claire's back, arms locking around her neck. But her skin was wrong. Cold. Hard. Like stone. She barely flinched. Then her elbow slammed into my ribs. I hit the sand, the breath knocked out of me. Lisa fought, kicking wildly, finally breaking free. She scrambled toward Dan, who was groggy but alive. We didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Dragging each other, half stumbling, we fled into the dunes. Behind us. That laugh. Low. Rasping. Echoing through the wind. But we didn't look back. We just ran. The campsite. Gone. Tents shredded. Gear scattered. Fire dead. Kyle missing. So was the cooler. The chairs. Everything. Lisa clutched her bleeding arm, sobbing. Dan's breath was ragged. We have to get to the car, he said. Now. We sprinted through the dunes, feet sinking into the cold sand. The sky was lightening. A sliver of dawn bleeding through the horizon. I could almost taste relief when I saw the SUV. Just past a knot of twisted pines. But something was wrong. I skidded to a stop, stomach dropping. The tires. Slashed. All four. Rubber shredded beyond repair. The windows were intact, but the body. Deep gouges. Like something had clawed it. Dan yanked the driver's door open, scrambling for the keys. Rummaged through the glove box. Nothing. The keys are gone, he whispered. Lisa let out a broken sob, sinking to her knees. We considered driving on the rims, but the SUV was angled on soft sand. We wouldn't get far. Dan cursed under his breath. My mind spun. We have to walk, I said. The ranger station is miles away, but if we stick to the coastline, we might find someone. Dan nodded. He hauled Lisa to her feet, supporting her weight. We started south, trudging along the damp, compact sand near the water's edge. The sun was rising, painting the sky a deep, bloody red, an unsettling color for a new day. We hadn't gone far when Lisa collapsed. She was losing too much blood. Dan tore off part of his shirt, wrapped it around her arm. I swallowed hard. We need help, I said. Now. Up ahead. A cluster of driftwood. Some worn-out fences, maybe from an old beach access. Better than nothing. We stumbled toward it, settling Lisa against a sun-bleached log. Her breathing was ragged. Then, her eyes widened. She was staring at the ocean. Tears streaked her face. What is it? I whispered. She just shook her head. Then I saw it. Kyle. Far down the beach. Walking toward us. Something was wrong with the way he moved. Slow. Deliberate. His head tilted at an odd angle. Dan and I tensed. I'll handle him, Dan muttered, standing. I grabbed his arm. Be careful. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut, trembling. Please, she whispered. Dan nodded. He stepped forward, moving to meet Kyle. They stopped about 30 feet apart. Dan raised his hands. spoke. Kyle just stared. Then, he lunged. They crashed onto the wet sand, rolling, struggling. Kyle on top, his hands locked around Dan's throat. Dan choked, gasping, fighting back. But Kyle, he was unnaturally strong. I ran, heart pounding. I snatched a jagged shell from the surf and stabbed it into Kyle's shoulder. He shrieked, but the sound, it wasn't human. A horrible, shrill, inhuman wail. Greenish-black fluid oozed from the wound. Not blood, not normal. Kyle's eyes snapped to mine, and then he backhanded me. The force sent me flying. I hit the surf, half submerged, water crashing over me. Salt burned my throat as I gasped for air. Through blurred vision, I saw Kyle turn back to Dan, hands tightening around his throat. And that's when I realized, Kyle wasn't Kyle anymore, and we were running out of time. Dan grabbed a rock, a big one. He raised it, and smashed it against Kyle's skull. Once, twice. Kyle collapsed face first into the water. For a second, I thought Dan might stop, might spare him. But Kyle's body twitched. Dan brought the rock down again. A sickening crunch. Tears streaked his face as Kyle finally went still. His breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered over to me, pulling me up. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. We stumbled back to Lisa. Her eyes were open, but distant, unfocused. Dan pressed down on her bandaged arm, trying to slow the bleeding. "We have to keep moving," I said. Even though my own body was battered, even though my vision spun. Lisa tried to speak, coughed, then whispered. I saw her. She was in Kyle's eyes. Her fingers curled weakly around Dan's wrist. She made him do it. "If she gets me too." Her voice broke. "Kill me. Promise me." Dan shook his head violently, tears rolling down his face. "Don't say that." Lisa just closed her eyes. The morning sun was bright. Too bright. It revealed the endless, empty shoreline. No people. No footprints. No signs of her. But I still felt her watching. Still felt that rasping laugh in the wind. Lisa was getting worse. Her body grew heavier between us as we half carried her down the beach. Time stretched. It felt like hours. And then, my heart sank. The dunes looked familiar. Too familiar. "Dan," I croaked. He didn't need to say it. He knew. We were looping back. Or maybe. The terrain was changing, toying with us. The tide had come in. The waves lapped at our feet. Dan's arms trembled from holding Lisa's weight. We weren't just losing her. We were close to collapse ourselves. That's when we saw it. A small Coast Guard patrol boat. Relief flooded me. I started waving, screaming for help. The men on board spotted us, steered closer. 2 officers waded into the surf. Dan and I practically sank into their arms, sobbing with exhaustion. They lifted Lisa first, carrying her into the boat. One of them draped blankets around Dan and me, handed us bottles of water. I gulped mine down, ignoring the burn in my throat. Dan clutched my arm, shaking. We babbled about the child, about Kyle, about the thing we saw. The officers' expressions darkened. One, tall, square-jawed, exchanged a look with the other. "There's no little girl here," he said. "You must be in shock." But I started. He gave a tight-lipped smile. "We'll get you medical attention. Let's not worry about anything else right now." Dan and I locked eyes. Something wasn't right. But we had no choice. We climbed aboard. Lisa barely stirred. One officer pressed a stethoscope to her chest. Then, turned to his partner, and shook his head. I saw it. I saw it. I grabbed his arm, my throat tightening. "What's wrong?" His voice was gentle. She's gone." I froze. No, she can't be." Dan looked at me, tears spilling onto his cheeks. I reached for Lisa's hand, but she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, wasn't Lisa anymore. The officer gently pulled me away, tucking the blanket tighter around my shoulders. A sob choked out of me. Reality blurred. The world tilted. Dan's voice was barely a rasp. What about Kyle? We had to. Let's not talk about that now, sir, the officer said. But his face. His eyes. He wasn't concerned about Lisa. Or Kyle. He was worried about what we knew. The boat reached a larger Coast Guard ship. As soon as we docked, men in dark uniforms stepped aboard. No insignias. No names. They took Dan and me into separate rooms, away from Lisa's body, and they started asking questions. Again. And again. And again. They scribbled notes. Whispered to each other. When I mentioned the girl's black eyes, I caught one of them. A slight grim nod to the other. Like confirmation. Like they already knew. Then, they told me to wait. I sat alone for what felt like hours. The small room hummed with the engine. Eventually, a man entered. Neatly pressed suit. Cold, detached eyes. FBI? Military? I didn't know. But I knew he wasn't just Coast Guard. Miss Carter, he said. We're sorry for your loss. His voice was calm. Too calm. We believe you and your companions encountered a dangerous individual. I swallowed. Dangerous individual? My voice was hollow. She was a child. Or at least, she looked like one. The man's expression didn't change. Sometimes criminals use children to elicit sympathy, he said. Either way, we'll conduct a thorough investigation. I was too exhausted to argue. My body felt detached, floating. And Lisa? I whispered. The man glanced at the door. We have medical professionals taking care of everything. A beat of silence. I'm sorry. Then he left. Hours later, they let me see Dan. Neither of us spoke. Not at first. They handed us stacks of paperwork. Legal documents. We barely read them. Just signed. They were statements. Swearing we wouldn't talk. Threatening us with legal consequences if we did. Dan's fingers trembled as he scrawled his name. I followed. What choice did we have? Within hours, we were dumped at a small clinic on the mainland. They gave us water, bandages, sedatives, and nothing else. No real answers. No real closure. They didn't believe us. Or maybe, they did. And that was worse. Because whatever we saw, whatever she was, they already knew. And they made sure no one else ever would. We tried to press for details. Where were their bodies? How would they be identified? What about their families? The authorities clammed up. By the time we were discharged from the clinic, we had more questions than answers. Lisa's parents never picked up. When I finally got through, the line disconnected the moment I mentioned Egg Island. Dan and I went to the local police, desperate for an official report. The officer on duty squinted at his computer screen. No record of any rescue. No record of Lisa Carter or Kyle Hayes. Nobody by those names reported missing. Dan snapped. That's impossible. The officer shrugged. Try the Coast Guard. So we did. They gave us the runaround. Passed us from department to department. Eventually, we gave up. We were exhausted. Mentally broken. The nightmares started almost immediately. Dan and I fought constantly. Grief, guilt, and something else ate away at whatever was left of our relationship. Within weeks, he moved out. I didn't have the energy to stop him. Months passed. One day, I found myself in the library archives. I don't even remember why I went. Maybe I was looking for something, some thread of truth. Or maybe the island wasn't done with me yet. That's where I found it. A brittle newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Tragedy on Egg Island, 1965. A family of 4. Vanished. Only a single shoe and torn clothing were ever found. The article included a black and white photograph. A husband. A wife. 2 children. But in the background, a small figure stood just beyond them. Dark-haired. Watching. Her face was blurred. But I knew. I knew it was her. I wish I could say that was the end of it. That I burned the clipping and never looked back. But the nightmares keep coming. Some nights, I see Kyle's lifeless eyes. Some nights, I see Lisa's blooded arms. And some nights, I see Dan. Beaten. Broken. Calling out to me. And in every dream, a little girl with black eyes stands on the shoreline, beckoning me, calling me back. Most people don't believe me. They call me a traumatized survivor of some tragic event. They make their own theories. A cult. Drug smugglers. A savage maniac living on the island. But I know what I saw. And I know the authorities did something to hide the truth. They took Lisa's body. They erased Kyle. And they warned us never to speak of that night again. But here I am, writing it down. Because whatever that thing was, it's still out there. Maybe it's waiting for another group of unsuspecting campers. Maybe it's been there for decades, centuries, feeding off lost souls on a remote island. So if you ever find yourself on Egg Island, watch the shore at night. Be wary of footprints that appear without warning. If you hear a child crying in the darkness, do not investigate. Pack your things. Leave. Because if you see her, if she asks for help, you've already lost. I can't tell you how to survive an encounter like that. I can't promise there's a way back. All I know is, I survived. And every morning, I wonder, am I the lucky one? Or the cursed one? My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old. And this happened on Egg Island, Maryland. If you ever find yourself there, if you see a little girl alone on the beach, trust me, leave her to the tide, and pray it's enough to keep her from following you home. I choked it up to kids messing around, but the nearest town was miles away, and the more I tried to ignore them, the more they appeared. One afternoon, I was checking my snares when I heard it. An engine echoing through the forest. Nobody but me should have been out there. My heart pounded as I crept back toward the cabin, rifle in hand. Then I saw it. An old pickup truck. For a moment, I relaxed. I recognized that truck. It was my old buddy, Benji Graves. We'd served together overseas. Not exactly close, but we'd been through the same hell. Still, he never gave me any warning when he was coming. "Red, you look like you've seen a ghost, man." Benji hopped out, a grin on his face, hauling 2 large duffel bags. He was pushing 40 now, still had that same cocky swagger. "Heard you were living out in the sticks, so I thought I'd pay a visit." I had a bad feeling. Rumor was, after the war, Benji got into some shady business. Arms dealing. Possibly worse. Still, I couldn't just tell him to leave. Hospitality. Leftover guilt. I don't know. I let him stay the night. We sat around a fire outside the cabin. Benji had brought a bottle of cheap whiskey. Offered me some. I refused. I didn't trust him enough to dull my senses out here. Especially with the forest still whispering. He just shrugged and took a long swig himself. "Man, you really went off the grid, huh? No phone. No neighbors. You sure you're okay with that?" I told him it was what I needed. He just nodded. Said nothing. Just stared into the fire. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep in the makeshift cot I kept in the corner. I stayed awake. Listening. That night, the whispers were louder. Just before dawn, a cry jolted me upright. Soft. Fragile. I grabbed my rifle and peered outside. The sound was coming from behind the old mill's foundation. My gut tightened. Then I saw it. A shape in the dirt. Slumped near the ruined wall. I rushed over, heart hammering. A woman. Barely conscious. Her face bruised. Cuts along her arms. She looked 25, maybe younger. She was trembling. Her clothes were torn, muddy. "Help," she whispered. "Please." I carried her inside. Benji bolted upright, eyes wide. "Jesus Christ, who the hell is that?" "Hannah," she rasped. "Hannah Wills. I'm a journalist." She was shivering. Tears streaking down her dirt-stained cheeks. She said she'd been investigating disappearances connected to a human trafficking ring. She thought Dead Man's Hollow was a holding site. She suspected the local sheriff was in on it. But when she got too close, they took her. They locked me up, she choked out. I got away, but they're still out there. Benji stiffened. Something in his expression shifted, like he was calculating something. But I ignored it. Focused on Hannah. Her wrists were deeply marked. Rope burns. My stomach twisted. This was no hoax. No ghost story. This was real. Then, gunfire. A single, sharp crack tore through the morning air. The bullet pinged off the side of the cabin. I ducked. Kill the lights, I barked. Benji was already moving. Hannah let out a choked scream. Outside, shadows flickered. Flashlights bobbed through the trees. At least 3 men. Maybe more. They found me, Hannah whispered, voice trembling. I signaled for silence. My pulse roared in my ears. We were sitting ducks. Another shot. The window shattered. Glass rained down. I shoved my sidearm into Hannah's shaking hands. She gripped it tight, but I wasn't sure she could even hold steady. Benji crouched near the door. Calm. Too calm. Like he'd expected this. And then, he smirked. I didn't have time to ask why. I counted to 3, and kicked the door open. Rifle raised. I fired a warning shot into the trees. A man cursed and ducked. Then, chaos. Figures rushed in from the darkness. Gunfire. Screams. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning. Somewhere in the fray, I heard a dog's growl. Benji's dog. I hadn't even noticed it before. The poor thing lunged at one of the attackers. But a gunshot silenced its bark. A yelp. Then nothing. A shadow moved fast. Before I could react, a massive figure tackled me. My head slammed against the dirt. A flash of pain. My rifle was ripped from my grip. Black spots danced in my vision. I heard Hannah scream. Then everything went hazy. When I came to, the cabin door was wide open. The lantern flickered inside, casting long, warped shadows. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor. My rifle was gone. My ears were ringing. Hannah was gone. And worse, Benji was gone too. I stumbled outside, my pulse thundering. The only traces of the fight were the blood spattered near my feet and the shattered cabin window. The attackers had vanished, leaving behind one thing. An overturned flashlight. Its beam illuminated a tree. And a carving. Fresh. Neat block letters. HANNAH. Over and over. My breath caught in my throat. Because it was in my handwriting. And I had no memory of doing it. A shiver crawled up my spine. I had seen war. I had seen men at their worst. But this felt different. It felt wrong. Like the forest itself was whispering a warning. That Hannah's fate was sealed. I spent hours searching. Dawn broke over the treetops as I followed broken branches and deep footprints. Then I found it. An old bunker entrance hidden beneath thick undergrowth. The metal door was slightly ajar. The air reeked of rot. I forced myself inside. The darkness swallowed me whole. Stepping carefully, I passed rusted machinery and crates half collapsed with age. Then I saw it. A small cell. Its gate swung open. The walls, smeared with fresh blood. A muffled cry made my stomach clench. I pressed forward, gun drawn. Then I reached a larger chamber. A single, naked light bulb swung from the ceiling, buzzing faintly. Chains rattled against the concrete walls. A battered old table stood in the center. But no sign of Hannah. Then, something else caught my eye. A black, oily substance pooled in the far corner. It glistened under the dim light, like it was breathing. I stepped closer. The wrongness of it made my stomach churn. Then I heard them. Voices. Men. Low and urgent. I flattened myself against the wall, straining to listen. I peeked around the corner, and saw 3 men. One of them was Sheriff Dave Lutz. He looked older than I remembered from the few times I'd seen him in town. But his posture was rigid. Cold. The second man. One of his deputies. The third. Benji. My heart twisted at the betrayal. They stood around a crumpled figure. Hannah, on her knees, her wrists bound behind her back, trembling. Her head hung low. Sheriff Lutz spoke to Benji, his voice quiet but firm. Something about the ring's next shipment. About how they should have taken her phone. Benji just glowered. I caught snippets. Hush money. The hag is restless. None of it made sense. Then the deputy pulled out a small ceramic bowl. Carefully, he set it down. Right by Hannah's face. Inside. That black, oily substance. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. Lutz grabbed Hannah's hair, jerking her head back. She let out a hoarse gasp. The deputy pried her mouth open. And poured. She choked. Gagged. The thick liquid dribbled down her chin. It shimmered. Like something alive. My pulse thundered. Then, Hannah's eyes rolled back. The air vibrated. Sheriff Lutz took a step back, suddenly spooked. Benji hissed, "What the hell?" Then Hannah's body went rigid. A cold draft blew through the bunker. I swear I heard whispers. Hundreds of them. Slithering from the walls. Then, her eyelids snapped open. Her pupils. Gone. Her eyes were pure black. And she was looking right at me. My chest tightened. She said nothing. Didn't scream. Just stared. And somehow, that was worse. Lutz muttered something under his breath. Then he said, "We need to move." He ordered Benji to finish it. "Kill her if she gets out of hand." Then Lutz and the deputy turned. Footsteps echoing down the corridor. As soon as they were gone, Benji knelt in front of Hannah. His hand shook. "God, what did they do to you?" he whispered. Gently, he reached forward. Tried to wipe the black liquid from her face. Then, she moved. Her fingers locked around his wrist. Unnaturally strong. Her neck cracked. A sick, wet pop as her head tilted at a stomach-turning angle. Then she whispered something. A voice that wasn't hers. The overhead bulb exploded. The chamber plunged into darkness. Benji let out a choked scream. Then, silence. I heard a sickening snap. That was my chance. I lunged forward, flicked on my flashlight, and aimed my pistol, but Hannah was already standing free from her bonds, bent over Benji's convulsing body. Her eyes locked on me, and her lips parted into a grin that revealed teeth smeared with black tar. I fired a shot into the ceiling, hoping to scare her or break whatever trance she was in. She looked at me with confusion, like she recognized me. For a split second, I saw the old Hannah, bruised and terrified, flicker in her eyes. "Help me," she rasped. I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from Benji. He was moaning, his arm twisted at an impossible angle. We staggered through the corridors, heading back the way I came. She leaned on me, coughing up that black bile. I could feel her trembling, but I also felt waves of heat radiating off her skin, as if she were running a fever of 110 degrees. We made it outside into the early morning light. The relief was short-lived. Sheriff Lutz and his deputy were waiting. They fired at us. I fired back. One bullet struck Lutz in the leg, and he went down, swearing. The deputy returned fire, clipping my shoulder. Pain ripped through me, and I nearly dropped Hannah, but a cold fury fueled me. I managed to squeeze off 3 rounds, hitting the deputy center mass. He collapsed. Hannah pulled free from me, her body twitching. She stared at Lutz, who was crawling toward his rifle. She moved so fast I barely registered it. One moment she was standing a few feet from me, the next she was on top of the sheriff, sinking her teeth into his neck. His scream rang out over the clearing. I stood there, stunned, gun raised, uncertain if I should shoot. The black fluid was smeared across Hannah's face, and she made a low, guttural sound. The sheriff's screams cut off with a wet gurgle, and I fought back nausea at the sight. She turned to me, eyes black as a starless night. I thought she was going to kill me next. Then her face twisted in anguish, and she whispered my name in a cracked voice. Eli. That second of lucidity tore me apart inside. I can't stop this, she said, trembling from head to foot. You have to kill me. Her eyes flickered from black to her normal brown, like she was fighting something inside. She looked so small, so lost. Then her eyes darkened again, and she hissed, lips curling back. I hesitated. God, I hesitated. And she lunged. Her nails raked my chest. I stumbled back, raising my gun, tears burning my eyes. She was too fast, already on me. I had no choice. The gun went off. One shot, then another. The recoil jolted through me. She crashed to the ground. I watched the blackness drain from her eyes, replaced by confusion, then sorrow, and then nothing. She was gone. The moment she died, a gust of wind rushed through the hollow, rustling the trees. In my dazed state, it sounded like laughter. I clutched my bleeding shoulder, still in shock. Sheriff Lutz's body was at the edge of the clearing, eyes glazed over, his neck torn. The deputy was dead. Benji was nowhere in sight, maybe still inside the bunker, maybe gone. I didn't care. Everything felt unreal, like I was a puppet in some cosmic horror show. I staggered back to my cabin. The whole place was riddled with bullet holes, the door hanging by one hinge. Blood stained the porch, some of it mine, some of it not. My supplies were scattered everywhere. I collapsed against a wall, letting the pain and fear wash over me. The sound of distant sirens yanked me from my daze. It was still morning, but I swore I saw flashing lights in the distance. Sure enough, within an hour, men in suits arrived. FBI, they said. They swarmed the area, combing through the ruins, the bunker, but they kept me at a distance, telling me to sit tight while they secured the scene. I recognized the smell of a cover-up immediately. I'd seen it in the military more times than I could count. No bodies came out of that bunker, no sign of Hannah, the sheriff, or the traffickers. An agent with a stern face asked me questions, but I gave them short, terse answers. He kept scribbling notes, then made a few calls. They insisted on taking me to the hospital for my shoulder, but once I was patched up, they said they wouldn't be pressing any charges. When I asked about Hannah, they said, "Who?" I nearly lost it, but I was too drained, physically, mentally, emotionally. I spent 2 days in a small clinic, a local one, apparently under the FBI's watch. When I returned to my cabin, it looked almost as if nothing had happened. The bullet holes were filled in, the door was replaced. I found no bloodstains. All the strange carvings on the trees were gone except for one. Behind the cabin, it bore Hannah's name, repeated a dozen times, in my handwriting, though. Add punctuation. Nothing else. I'd snap awake, rifle in hand, expecting to see her standing there with black eyes, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. A week later, I packed up my essentials, planning to leave for good. As I stepped outside, a breeze rustled the trees, carrying a faint, almost mocking voice. "You should have let me live." My blood ran cold. My shoulder ached with phantom pain. In the daylight, the forest looked peaceful, but I knew better. Dead Man's Hollow had changed me, and it wasn't letting go. I never did find out what became of Benji. Part of me wanted to hunt him down for answers, but another part hoped he got what he deserved. As for the FBI, they never contacted me again. The official story in the local paper was that Sheriff Dave Lutz died in a shootout with unknown criminals. No mention of Hannah Wells. No mention of a trafficking ring. Just another tragedy in a remote area no one cared about. Sometimes, at night, I dream about that black, oily substance sliding down Hannah's face, her eyes turning so dark they seemed to swallow the world. I dream about the hag they whispered about in the bunker, the legend that the executed witch's spirit still roamed these woods, feeding on fear, betrayal, and despair. I can't say I believe everything I saw, but I can't deny the scars, both on my body and in my mind. I've seen men break in war zones. I've seen horrors that don't have a name. But nothing prepared me for Dead Man's Hollow. I left that place, but it never really left me. My last night there, before I drove away, I stood outside and stared at the one remaining carving on the tree, Hannah. My hand fit perfectly over the etched letters, as though I'd been the one who made them. And I felt the wind at my back, a cold wind that whispered her name. I sometimes think about the life she lost, the truth she never got to publish, about how I had to kill her to save myself and maybe save her from something worse. As I drove off, I felt the Hollow's ancient eyes watching me, letting me go but keeping a part of me behind. Even now, I can't say I'm free. Maybe no one who goes there ever is. Story 5. My name is Jack Calloway. I'm 36 years old, and I served 2 tours in Afghanistan before retiring from the military with a handful of medals and a head full of nightmares. This happened last summer, when I thought heading off-grid for a while might help me find some peace. Instead, I found horror deeper than any battlefield I've ever known. I decided on Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland, a sprawling marshland that promised solitude. My dog, Jax, a black Labrador who'd stuck by my side through everything, was the only companion I truly trusted. But I wasn't going entirely alone. A friend from my military days, Danny Harper, insisted on joining. Danny is 2 years older than me and has a paranoid streak a mile wide. He's always certain that behind every curtain, there's a hidden government secret waiting to be uncovered. Normally, I steer clear of conspiracies, but Danny was an old comrade, and part of me felt responsible for him. Before we left, we met up with Emily Rhodes, a local historian in the small town just outside Blackwater. She was slender, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, and had an air of quiet determination. Emily claimed she was researching the legends of the refuge, stories about a ghostly figure people called the Banshee of Blackwater. The rumor was that this spectre appeared before tragic deaths, her screams echoing across the marsh at night. Emily warned us that several visitors had vanished over the years, including her own brother 3 years ago. She'd come to terms with the idea that she might never see him again, but she continued her research, trying to piece together the puzzle of disappearances. I brushed off talk of ghosts. After everything I'd seen in combat, I figured no spirit could terrify me more than what human beings could do to each other. Danny, however, latched onto every word. "It's always the same story, Jack," he told me. "Government experiments, missing people, they're covering something up." I told him he was reading too many tabloids, but I couldn't shake a slight unease. I've always trusted my gut, and there was something about Emily's eyes, something that said she'd seen real tragedy. On the first day of the trip, the swamp was hot and muggy. The air buzzed with mosquitoes, and the pungent smell of decaying vegetation clung to everything. We set up a small base camp far away from the usual trails, near a quiet stretch of water where Jax could swim. It felt serene at first, but as dusk fell, I began to sense a strange emptiness. When night fully draped the marsh, I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my rifle and flashlight. Jax was already at the tent flap, growling low and deep. I unzipped it just enough to peer outside. The campfire had died down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. Danny was on his feet, pistol in hand, shouting into the darkness. Emily was crouched behind a tree, her face pale and terrified. "What's going on?" I hissed, stepping out into the cold night air. Danny spun around, his eyes wild. "They're out there, Jack. I saw them, men in camo, moving through the trees. They shot at me." Before I could respond, another gunshot rang out, and a bullet whizzed past, embedding itself in a tree trunk. Jack barked furiously, his hackles raised. I grabbed Danny by the arm and yanked him down behind a fallen log. Emily was already there, clutching the flare gun with trembling hands. "Stay down," I ordered, peering over the log. The forest was alive with movement, shadows darting between trees, the occasional glint of moonlight off a rifle barrel. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just some paranoid delusion of Danny's. We were under attack. "Who the hell are they?" Danny whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, "but we need to get out of here. Now." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Jax let out a yelp and darted behind me. I glanced at Emily. "You okay?" She nodded, though her face was ashen. "I think so. But we can't stay here." "Agreed," I said. "We need to move. Stay low and follow me." We crawled away from the campsite, keeping to the shadows. The forest was eerily silent except for the occasional crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. My mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want? And why were they so determined to keep us out of the marsh? We made it about 50 yards before Danny froze. "Wait," he whispered, pointing ahead. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It wasn't the warm glow of a campfire but something colder, more unnatural. As we crept closer, the light grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from a clearing. In the center stood a makeshift structure, like some kind of research station. There were generators, antennas, and a large metal container that looked like it belonged in a lab. "What the hell is this?" Danny muttered. Before I could answer, a voice boomed from behind us. "Stop right there." I spun around to see Jeb Langley and his men emerging from the trees, rifles trained on us. Jeb's face was hard, his eyes cold. "I told you to leave," he said. "You should have listened." "Who are you?" I demanded, raising my rifle. "What are you doing out here?" Jeb smirked. "Classified. But you're trespassing. And now you've seen too much." Danny stepped forward, his pistol shaking in his hand. "You can't just shoot us. This is public land." Jeb's smirk widened. "Who's gonna stop us?" "The sheriff. He's on our payroll." My blood ran cold. Sheriff Baylor. That's why he'd been so cold, so dismissive. He was in on whatever this was. Jeb raised his rifle. "Last chance. Turn around and walk away. Or don't. Either way, you're not leaving this marsh alive." I tightened my grip on my rifle, my mind racing. We were outnumbered and outgunned. But I wasn't about to go down without a fight. Before I could make a move, a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. It was the same sound we'd heard before, the banshee's wail. Jeb and his men froze, their eyes darting nervously. "What the hell was that?" one of them muttered. Jeb shook his head. "Ignore it. Focus on." The scream came again, closer this time. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It was a figure, cloaked in tattered rags, its face obscured by a veil of mist. It moved unnaturally, gliding across the ground like it wasn't touching it. The air around it seemed to warp, and the temperature dropped sharply. Jeb's men panicked, firing wildly into the trees. The figure, the banshee, let out another scream, and the sound was like a physical force, knocking one of the men off his feet. Jeb backed away, his bravado gone. "Fall back," he shouted. "Fall back." As they retreated into the darkness, the banshee turned its gaze on us. I felt a chill run down my spine. Its eyes, if it even had eyes, were like voids, empty and endless. For a moment, it just stood there, as if considering us. Then, with a final, haunting wail, it vanished into the mist. We stood there, frozen, until Danny broke the silence. What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We didn't stop moving until we reached the edge of the marsh. By the time we made it back to civilization, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the refuge. We reported everything to the authorities, but as I expected, nothing came of it. The sheriff denied any involvement, and Jeb Langley and his men were nowhere to be found. Emily disappeared soon after, leaving behind only a note that said, "Some things are better left buried." Danny and I stayed in touch, but he was never the same. He became obsessed with uncovering the truth, convinced that the banshee was some kind of government experiment gone wrong. I tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunted me. Even now, years later, I can still hear the banshee's scream echoing in my mind. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can feel the marsh calling me back. But I'll never go there again. Some places, some horrors, are better left in the dark. I hesitated, torn between stopping him and saving Emily. "Danny," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Snap out of it. It's me, Jack." For a split second, his face twitched, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But then his body jerked again, and he raised the machete, his expression blank once more. I ducked as the blade swung toward me, the cold steel whistling past my ear. Jax lunged at Danny, snarling and biting at his legs, but Danny kicked him away with unnatural strength. My dog yelped and skidded across the floor. I scrambled to my feet, gripping the rifle tightly. "Danny, please," I begged, but he was already advancing again, the machete gleaming in the dim light. I had no choice. I raised the rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the shack. Danny froze, a look of confusion crossing his face as he dropped the machete and clutched his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, and he collapsed to his knees. "Jack," he whispered, his voice trembling. I couldn't stop it. I dropped the rifle and rushed to his side, catching him as he fell. "I'm sorry, Danny," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." His body went limp in my arms, and I held him tightly, my heart breaking. Jax whimpered beside me, nuzzling Danny's hand. The shack was silent except for the sound of my ragged breathing and Emily's muffled sobs. But the nightmare wasn't over. Outside, I heard Jeb's voice, cold and mocking. "You think you've won? You think you can stop her? She's always hungry. Always." I gently laid Danny down and grabbed the rifle, my hands shaking. "Stay here," I told Jax, though I knew he wouldn't listen. I stepped outside, the swamp air thick and oppressive. Jeb was dragging Emily toward the water, a knife pressed to her throat. Her eyes met mine, filled with terror. "Let her go, Jeb," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "This ends now." Jeb laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't get it, do you? She's already here." As if on cue, the banshee's scream tore through the air, louder and more piercing than before. The sound was paralyzing, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears. Jeb released Emily, his face pale with fear. No, not me," he stammered, backing away. "I gave you what you wanted." The banshee emerged from the mist, her form shifting and writhing like smoke. Her eyes, if you could call them that, were voids of darkness, and her mouth stretched impossibly wide as she let out another ear-splitting wail. Jeb turned to run, but she was on him in an instant, her claw-like hands tearing into him. His screams were cut short as she dragged him into the water, leaving only ripples behind. Emily and I stared in horror, unable to move. The banshee turned her gaze on us, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then she let out a final, mournful cry and vanished into the mist. The swamp fell silent. Emily and I clung to each other, trembling. Jax pressed against my leg, his tail tucked between his legs. We didn't speak. There were no words for what we'd just witnessed. We made our way back to civilization, battered and broken. The authorities didn't believe our story, of course. They chalked it up to a tragic accident, a case of hikers getting lost in the swamp. But I knew the truth. The banshee was real, and she was still out there, waiting. I never went back to Blackwater. Emily moved away, and we lost touch. Jack stayed by my side, a constant reminder of the horrors we'd faced. But even now, years later, I can still hear the banshees scream in my dreams. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can feel her watching me, waiting for the day I return to the marsh. But I won't. Some places, some horrors, are better left in the dark. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The weight of everything we'd been through pressed down on me like a physical force. Danny was gone. The banshee, the cult, the sheriff's complicity, it all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But Emily's question hung in the air, demanding an answer. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "But we can't just pretend this didn't happen. Danny deserves more than that." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We have to tell someone. Someone who'll listen. Someone who can stop them." I glanced at her, then back at the road. The sheriff said no one would believe us. And if he's right, we could end up making things worse. Those people, Jeb, the others, they're dangerous. And they're not alone. The sheriff's in on it. Who knows how far this goes? Emily clenched her fists in her lap. So we just let it go. Let them keep doing whatever they're doing out there. Let Danny's death mean nothing. I didn't have an answer. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt, anger, and fear. Jax whined softly from the back seat, as if sensing my turmoil. I reached back to scratch his ear, finding a small comfort in his presence. "We need proof," I said finally. "Something concrete. Something that can't be ignored. If we go to the authorities with just our word, they'll dismiss us as crazy. But if we can show them what's really happening out there..." Emily nodded slowly, her expression hardening. Then we go back. We find something, anything, that can expose them. I shook my head. Not yet. We're in no shape to go back there now. We need time to recover, to plan. And we need to be smart about this. If we rush in, we'll end up like Danny. Emily didn't argue, but I could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let this go, and neither was I. But for now, we needed to regroup, to heal, to figure out our next move. We drove in silence for a while, the miles stretching out behind us. Eventually, Emily spoke again, her voice softer this time. Do you think Danny knew? At the end, I mean. Do you think he knew it was you? I swallowed hard, the memory of Danny's face, his eyes clearing, his voice breaking, flashing in my mind. I think he did, I said quietly. And I think he forgave me. Emily reached over and squeezed my hand. He wouldn't have wanted you to blame yourself. You did what you had to do. You saved us. Her words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who'd failed his friend. But I knew she was right. Danny wouldn't have wanted me to carry this guilt forever. When we reached town, I dropped Emily off at her apartment. She hesitated before getting out of the car, her hand on the door handle. You'll call me, right? When you're ready to go back. I nodded. I will. But for now, get some rest. You've been through hell. She gave me a small, tired smile. You too, Jack. Take care of yourself. And Jax. I watched her walk up to her building, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Then I drove home, Jax resting his head on the back of my seat. My cabin felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing in on me. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, the events of the past few days replaying in my mind. Jax nudged my hand with his nose, whining softly. I scratched behind his ears, grateful for his presence. We'll figure this out, buddy, I said, more to myself than to him. We'll make it right. But as I lay down that night, the banshee's scream echoed in my dreams. And I knew, deep down, that Blackwater wasn't done with me. Not yet. The weight of your words settles like a stone in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. The echoes of Blackwater cling to you, a shadow that refuses to fade, no matter how far you run or how hard you try to bury it. The banshee's scream, Danny's face, the sheriff's cold indifference, it all loops in your mind, a relentless reel of guilt and dread. You survived, but survival comes at a cost, and the price is paid in sleepless nights and haunted days. Jax whines again, his ears twitching as he stares out the window into the darkness. You follow his gaze, half expecting to see a figure standing there, cloaked in mist, with eyes like voids. But there's nothing. Just the wind rustling the trees and the faint, distant cry that might be your imagination, or might not be. You sit down, your hands trembling as you run them through your hair. The cabin feels too small, too quiet, yet too loud with the memories that scream in your mind. You think about Danny, about the way his eyes cleared for just a moment, the way he whispered your name. You think about the blood on your hands, the choices you made, and the ones you didn't. You think about Emily, about whether she hears the whispers too, or if she's found a way to silence them. And then there's the banshee. Whether she's a spirit, a manifestation of the swamp's darkness, or something else entirely, she's real to you. Her scream is real. Her hunger is real. And you can't shake the feeling that she's not done with you yet. You stand, pacing the room, trying to outrun the thoughts that chase you. But they're faster, sharper, more persistent. You glance at the rifle leaning against the wall, the one you used to defend yourself, to survive. It feels heavier now, a reminder of what you've lost and what you've become. Jax nudges your leg, his warm presence a small comfort in the cold, unyielding grip of your guilt. You kneel beside him, burying your face in his fur. What do I do, boy? You whisper, your voice breaking. How do I make this right? He doesn't answer, of course. He just licks your hand, his tail thumping softly against the floor. And for a moment, the whispers fade, the screams quiet, and you feel a flicker of peace. But it doesn't last. It never does. You know what you have to do. You can't outrun Blackwater, but maybe you can face it. Maybe you can find the proof you need to expose the cult, to bring justice for Danny, to silence the banshee's scream once and for all. Or maybe you'll just become another victim, another soul lost to the swamp's insatiable hunger. Either way, you can't keep living like this, haunted by the past and hunted by the present. You grab your jacket, your flashlight, and the rifle. Jax follows you to the door, his ears perked, his eyes alert. You hesitate, looking down at him. "Stay here, buddy," you say, your voice firm. "I can't risk losing you too." He whines, but he obeys, sitting by the door as you step out into the night. The air is thick, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the wind carries that faint, mocking cry. You take a deep breath, steeling yourself, and start walking toward the edge of the woods. Blackwater is calling, and this time, you're going to answer. Next story. I've always been the type of person who could brush off the unexplainable, rolling my eyes at tales of ghostly encounters or mysterious phenomena. That changed irrevocably on a crisp October evening in 2018. My name is Elena Martinez, and at 28, I was feeling suffocated by my job as a software developer in San Francisco. The relentless pace of the tech industry had worn me down, and I desperately needed an escape from the constant notifications and deadlines. That's how I found myself planning a solo camping trip to Willow Creek State Park, nestled in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. The promise of towering evergreens, mist-shrouded mountains, and the absence of cell service beckoned to me like a siren's call. I envisioned myself breathing in the earthy scent of autumn, my mind finally free from the digital chains that bound me to my desk. As I crossed the state line into Oregon, a sense of anticipation built in my chest. The congested freeways gave way to winding country roads, fiery maples, and golden aspens lining my path. I rolled down the windows of my rental car, letting the cool air tousle my hair as I sang along to my road trip playlist. By late afternoon, I arrived at the small town of Millbrook, the gateway to Willow Creek State Park. The quaint main street was lined with weathered storefronts and cafes that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. I stopped at the general store to pick up some last-minute supplies, extra batteries for my headlamp, a local map, and some trail mix. The elderly shopkeeper, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyed me curiously as she rang up my purchases. "Heading up to the park, are you?" she asked, her voice gravelly but kind. I nodded, offering a friendly smile. "Yeah, thought I'd do some camping and hiking, get away from the city for a bit." She hesitated for a moment, her weathered hands pausing over the cash register. "Well, you be careful up there, young lady. Stick to the marked trails, and make sure you're back before dark. We've had some strange occurrences lately." I chuckled, assuming she was trying to spook the city girl. "Thanks for the warning. I'll keep an eye out for Bigfoot," I joked, grabbing my bag of supplies. The woman didn't laugh. Instead, she fixed me with a stern gaze that made my smile falter. "I'm serious, Ms. Martinez. There's been talk of hikers going missing, odd noises in the woods at night. Just be careful, all right?" I nodded, sobered by her tone, and headed out to my car. As I drove the winding road up to the park entrance, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling her words had left me with. But I pushed it aside, chalking it up to small-town superstition and my own overactive imagination. The ranger at the entrance station was much more cheerful, handing me a map of the campgrounds and hiking trails with a broad smile. "Enjoy your stay at Willow Creek. Remember, leave no trace, and watch out for wildlife. We've got some black bears in the area, so store your food properly." I thanked him and drove to my assigned campsite, a secluded spot nestled among towering Douglas firs. As I set up my tent and organized my gear, I felt the stress of the city melting away. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sweet scent of pine and decaying leaves. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and a nearby stream provided a soothing backdrop of white noise. With my camp established, I decided to take a short hike before sunset. I chose a trail that promised scenic views of the surrounding mountains, making sure to bring my water bottle, a snack, and my fully charged phone. Despite the lack of service, I wanted it for photos. The trail started off easy enough, winding through dense forest and occasional clearings that offered glimpses of the rugged landscape beyond. As I hiked, I found myself relaxing more and more, my mind clearing of the clutter that had plagued it for months. About an hour into my hike, I came across another solo traveler resting on a fallen log. He was a man in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and keen blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled in greeting. "Hey there," he called out as I approached. "Nice day for a hike, huh?" I nodded, pausing to catch my breath. "Definitely. I'm Elena, by the way. Nice to meet you." "Elena, I'm Daniel," he replied, extending a hand. As we shook, I noticed a series of intricate tattoos peeking out from under his sleeve, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move as he flexed his arm. We fell into easy conversation, swapping stories about our respective journeys to Willow Creek. Daniel, it turned out, was something of a nomad, traveling from one national park to another in a beat-up van he'd converted into a mobile home. "There's just something about these wild places," he mused, gesturing to the forest around us. "They remind you of how small we really are in the grand scheme of things, you know?" I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. We continued chatting as we hiked, Daniel pointing out various plants and bird calls he recognized. His knowledge of the wilderness was impressive, and I found myself hanging on his every word. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, we decided to head back to our respective campsites. We made plans to meet up the next day for a longer hike, exchanging campsite numbers. That night, as I sat by my campfire roasting marshmallows, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. The worries of my job and the pressures of city life seemed a million miles away. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring a symphony of chirps, hoots, and rustles that was both eerie and comforting. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, a sound cut through the normal forest noise, a high-pitched keening wail that sent shivers down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human and not quite animal. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. A fox, perhaps? Or some kind of owl I wasn't familiar with? The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Without thinking, I doused my fire and retreated to the safety of my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. As I lay in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, I tried to convince myself that it was just another forest creature, nothing to be afraid of. But as the wails continued through the night, sometimes seeming to come from all directions at once, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong in Willow Creek State Park. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. Sleep eluded me that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me on edge, my imagination conjuring terrifying possibilities. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted. The forest seemed almost mockingly peaceful in the soft morning light, as if the previous night's terrors had been nothing more than a bad dream. I was making coffee on my portable stove when Daniel appeared at the edge of my campsite, looking far too chipper for the early hour. "Morning, Elena," he called out, striding over. "Ready for that hike?" I hesitated, the memory of those eerie wails still fresh in my mind. "Actually, Daniel, I heard some strange noises last night." "Did you?" "Yeah," he interrupted, a flicker of something passing over his face. "Probably just coyotes. They can sound pretty weird sometimes. Nothing to worry about." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, I want to show you this amazing viewpoint. It'll take your mind off things." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We set off on a trail that Daniel said would lead us to a secluded waterfall. As we hiked, I found myself studying my companion more closely. There was something off about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. His knowledge of the area seemed too extensive for a casual visitor, and he navigated the unmarked trails with unsettling ease. About 2 hours into our hike, we veered off the main path onto a barely visible game trail. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in on all sides, and an oppressive silence fell, broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Daniel," I panted, struggling to keep up, "are you sure this is the right way? We've gone pretty far off trail." He turned to me, that same unreadable expression flitting across his face. "Trust me, Elena. It's just a little further." As we pushed through a thick stand of ferns, we suddenly emerged into a small clearing. My breath caught in my throat. In the center stood the crumbling remains of what looked like an old cabin. Nature had long since begun reclaiming it, with vines snaking up the weathered logs and moss carpeting what was left of the roof. But it wasn't the cabin itself that sent a chill down my spine, it was the strange symbols carved into every available surface. The door, the window frames, even the trees surrounding the clearing. They looked ancient, yet the grooves seemed freshly cut, oozing sap in some places. What is this place?" I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from the unsettling scene. Daniel's voice, when he replied, had lost all its earlier warmth. "This, Elena, is where the real Willow Creek reveals itself." I turned to him, a question forming on my lips, but the words died in my throat. Daniel's eyes, once a friendly blue, now gleamed solid black in the dim forest light. His tattoos seemed to writhe and shift on his skin, no longer resembling any earthly patterns. "You see," he continued, advancing on me with an inhuman grace, "we've been waiting for someone like you. Someone untethered. Easy to make disappear." I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root as I fell. I caught a glimpse of movement in the cabin's darkened doorway, pale, childlike figures with cold black eyes, their mouths stretched in impossible grins. The last thing I heard before my head struck the forest floor was a familiar high-pitched wail, the same sound that had haunted me the night before, but this time it was coming from Daniel's distorted mouth. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding. I was back in my tent, early morning light filtering through the fabric. Had it all been a nightmare? The hike, the cabin, Daniel's transformation, it all seemed so vivid, yet here I was, safe in my sleeping bag. Shaking off the lingering unease, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air. That's when I saw it, a small pile of pine needles on my picnic table, arranged in the same bizarre symbols I'd seen in my dream. My blood ran cold as I heard a twig snap in the nearby underbrush. Slowly, I turned to face the sound, dreading what I might see. There, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, stood a pale figure with jet-black eyes. It raised one finger to its lips in a shushing motion, a grotesque parody of a child's gesture. In that moment, I realized with horrifying clarity that my nightmare was just beginning. Panic seized me as I stared at the otherworldly, childlike figure. Its unnaturally wide grin stretched impossibly further, and suddenly, it darted back into the woods with inhuman speed. Without thinking, I sprinted in the opposite direction, my feet pounding against the forest floor. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms. The morning mist clung to everything, making the forest seem even more surreal and disorienting. Behind me, I could hear the high-pitched wails multiplying, echoing from all directions. As I burst through a thicket, I found myself face to face with a startled hiker, a middle-aged woman with a walking stick and a look of concern on her face. "Are you all right?" she asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. The woman's expression shifted from concern to alarm. Okay, just breathe," she said soothingly. "I'm a park ranger. My name's Maria. Let's get you back to the ranger station, and you can tell me everything." As we walked, I recounted my experiences, the strange noises, Daniel, the cabin, and the terrifying children. Maria listened intently, her brow furrowed. When we reached the ranger station, she ushered me inside and handed me a cup of strong coffee. "Elena," she said gently, "I need you to listen carefully. What you've experienced, well, you're not the first." She proceeded to tell me a story that chilled me to my core. Willow Creek State Park, it turned out, had a long history of disappearances and strange occurrences. Local indigenous legends spoke of a thin veil between worlds in this area and of entities that could cross over, entities that fed on fear and confusion. "We've tried to keep it quiet," Maria explained, "to avoid panic. But every few years, someone like you stumbles into their world. Most don't make it back." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. "So, Daniel, the children." Maria nodded grimly. "Manifestations, we think. Or maybe possessed victims. We're not sure. But they're drawn to people who are untethered, as Daniel called you, people looking to escape their lives, people who wouldn't be immediately missed." A thought struck me. The shopkeeper in town, she tried to warn me. Old Mrs. Harlow. Yes, she's one of the few who know. She does what she can to subtly warn folks, but... Maria trailed off, shaking her head. Over the next few hours, I gave a detailed statement to Maria and her colleagues. They seemed to take my story seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. As the day wore on, a plan was formed. I would leave the park immediately, escorted by rangers. They would investigate the areas I described, though Maria warned me not to expect much. The entities were known to cover their tracks well. As I prepared to leave, Maria pulled me aside. Elena, I need you to understand something. What you've seen, what you've experienced, it's going to stay with you. You might be tempted to talk about it, to try to warn others. Don't. She pressed a business card into my hand. If you need to talk, if you start seeing things back in the real world, you call this number. We have people who can help. But for your own safety, and for the safety of others, you can't spread this story. Do you understand? I nodded numbly, the weight of secrecy already settling heavily on my shoulders. The drive back to San Francisco was a blur. I kept expecting to see black-eyed children in my rearview mirror or Daniel's distorted face grinning at me from passing cars. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. In the weeks and months that followed, I tried to readjust to my normal life. I threw myself into my work, took up meditation, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of Willow Creek lingered, coloring my perception of the world. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a sound that reminded me of those unearthly wails. I'd see a tattoo on someone's arm that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. In those moments, my hand would instinctively go to my wallet, feeling for the edges of Maria's card, my lifeline to the truth, my reminder that I wasn't crazy. I never returned to Willow Creek State Park. My appetite for wilderness adventures had been thoroughly quenched. But I often found myself wondering about other untethered souls who might wander into that forest, unaware of the horrors that lurked beyond the veil. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I questioned my own experiences. Had it all been real? Or was I simply a burnt-out tech worker who had a psychotic break in the woods? The rational part of my mind wanted to believe the latter, but deep down, I knew the truth. The world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. And sometimes, the monsters are all too real. They're out there, waiting in the shadows of ancient forests, in the echoes of otherworldly wails, in the black eyes of things that pretend to be human. As for me, I've learned to live with the knowledge, to carry my secret. But I'll never forget the lessons. I learned in Willow Creek to be wary of friendly strangers in the woods, to trust my instincts when something feels off, and above all, to be careful what kind of escape I wish for, because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The crisp autumn air bit at my exposed skin as I trudged through the dense undergrowth of the Whispering Pines National Forest. My name is **Alex Hartley **, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. Today, my quarry was a particularly elusive 12-point buck that had been taunting me for the past week. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of fallen leaves, their earthy scent rising with each step I took. The sound of my boots crunching through the detritus seemed amplified in the eerie stillness of the early morning. Despite my familiarity with these woods, something felt off. I paused, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the surrounding trees. The gnarled branches of ancient pines creaked and swayed overhead, their movement seeming almost deliberate. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unsettling thought. *pre-hunt jitters*, I told myself. Nothing more. Growing up with my mother, Sarah, hunting had always been our way of connecting. She was a tough woman, having raised me single-handedly after my father's passing when I was just a toddler. These trips into the wilderness were our escape from the monotony of small-town life in nearby Pinewood Grove. As I pressed deeper into the forest, the uneasy feeling continued to gnaw at me. The usual chorus of birdsong was conspicuously absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, breaking through the quiet, I heard something that made my blood run cold: laughter. It was a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles whitening around the familiar wooden stock. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and afraid in the vast expanse of the forest. No response came, save for the echo of my own words bouncing back at me from the dense foliage. Steeling myself, I decided to investigate. I moved cautiously, each step carefully placed to minimize noise. As I approached a thick cluster of bushes, I heard frantic rustling. Before I could react, a man burst through the undergrowth, nearly bowling me over in his haste. "Jesus Christ!" I exclaimed, stumbling backward. The man before me was a mess, clothes torn, face scratched and bleeding, eyes wild with terror. "Please," he gasped, clutching at my jacket, "you got to help me. There's something in these woods, something not right." I studied him carefully, noting the genuine fear in his eyes. He didn't look like a drug addict or some random lunatic. If anything, he reminded me of the hikers and campers I often encountered in these parts. "Slow down," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "What's after you? A bear? Mountain lion?" The man shook his head violently. "I don't know what it is," he replied, his voice cracking. It's not human. It took my friend. Tore him apart like he was made of paper." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I'd been hunting these woods for over 2 decades, and I'd never encountered anything that could do what this man was describing. Still, the terror in his eyes was real enough. "Okay," I said, making a quick decision. "Show me where this happened. But stay close and keep quiet." The man nodded, seemingly relieved to have someone else take charge. As we began to retrace his steps, I caught sight of something that made my stomach churn. Deep, jagged claw marks scored the trunk of a nearby pine. They were far too high up to have been made by any bear I'd ever encountered. We pressed on, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had us both jumping, our nerves stretched to the breaking point. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes or so, we stumbled upon a clearing. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my days. The remnants of a campsite lay before us, but it looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Tents were shredded, their contents strewn about haphazardly. Sleeping bags lay in tatters, and a cooler had been smashed open, its contents spilling out onto the forest floor. But it was the smell that hit me first, the coppery tang of blood mixed with something else, something rank and animalistic that made my gorge rise. And then I saw them, the remains. I've field-dressed countless deer in my time, but nothing could have prepared me for the carnage before me. What was left of a human body lay scattered around the campsite like discarded pieces of a broken doll. The violence of the attack was evident in every torn limb and shattered bone. "Oh God," the man beside me whimpered, turning away to retch into the bushes. I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. In all my years as a hunter, I'd never encountered anything capable of this level of savagery. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations, a pack of wolves, maybe, or a particularly aggressive bear. But deep down, I knew that no natural predator could have done this. As I surveyed the grisly scene, my eyes caught something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a set of tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with long, cruel-looking claw marks extending from each toe. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Whatever did this, it might still be nearby. The man nodded frantically, his face pale and drawn. As we turned to leave, a twig snapped somewhere in the depths of the forest. We both froze, straining our ears for any further sound. For a long moment, all was quiet. Then, carried on the chill autumn breeze, came a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It was a sound that spoke to something primordial in my brain, triggering an instinctive fight-or-flight response that had my heart racing and my palms sweating. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Run." We took off through the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls, and the snapping of branches. Whatever was chasing us was big, and it was fast. As we ran, my mind raced with childhood stories and local legends, tales of the Wendigo, a creature of Native American lore said to stalk these very woods. Stories whispered around campfires about hikers and hunters who ventured too deep into the forest and were never seen again. I'd always dismissed such tales as nonsense, the product of overactive imaginations and too much moonshine. But now, with the sound of our pursuer growing ever closer, I found myself believing. We burst out of the tree line and onto a narrow dirt road. In the distance, I could see the welcoming glow of lights, civilization, safety. But between us and that sanctuary lay at least a mile of open ground. There, I gasped, pointing towards an old fire tower that loomed above the treetops. We can make a stand there. We veered off the road and sprinted towards the tower. As we reached its base, I could hear our pursuer crashing through the underbrush behind us. Without a second thought, we began to climb. The rusted metal of the tower's ladder bit into my hands as I hauled myself up rung by rung. Below me, I could hear the labored breathing of the man I'd found in the woods. And below him, I dared a glance downward and immediately wished I hadn't. There, at the base of the tower, stood a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its body was covered in matted fur, and its limbs ended in wicked, curved claws. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with glowing yellow eyes that radiated malevolence. As I watched in horror, the creature began to climb. Faster, I yelled, redoubling my efforts to reach the top of the tower. We scrambled onto the platform just as a clawed hand swiped at the last man's leg, tearing through denim and flesh alike. I slammed the trapdoor shut, but it was a flimsy barrier at best. The whole tower shook as the creature below us roared in frustration. "What do we do now?" the injured man asked, his voice trembling with pain and fear. I looked around frantically, searching for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a red metal box bolted to one wall of the platform. "Fire equipment," I muttered, wrenching it open. Inside, I found our salvation, an old flare gun, loaded and ready to fire. The tower shuddered again as our pursuer renewed its efforts to reach us. The trapdoor began to splinter under the assault. "When I give the signal," I said, gripping the flare gun tightly, "open the door." The man looked at me like I was insane but nodded grimly. He positioned himself by the trapdoor, ready to lift it. "Now," I shouted. As the door swung open, I caught a glimpse of gnashing teeth and burning yellow eyes. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The flare erupted from the gun with a hiss, striking the creature square in the face. It let out an unearthly shriek of pain and rage, losing its grip on the tower. We watched in stunned silence as it plummeted to the ground far below. For a long moment, all was quiet. Then, in the distance, we heard the blessed sound of sirens. Help was on the way. As the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances appeared on the horizon, I turned to the man beside me. "What's your name?" I asked, realizing I'd never bothered to find out. "Mike," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Mike Donovan. Thanks for everything." I nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. "Alex Hartley," I said. "And I have a feeling our lives are never going to be the same after this." As the authorities arrived and we were helped down from the tower, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever that creature was, I doubted it was the only one of its kind. The Whispering Pines National Forest had always been my sanctuary, my home away from home. But now, as I looked back at the dark tree line, I realized that it held secrets far darker and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, something was waiting. Watching. Hungry. The hunt, it seemed, was far from over. In the days that followed, life in Pinewood Grove took on a surreal quality. Mike and I were questioned extensively by local law enforcement and forest rangers. We told our story countless times, each retelling making it sound more unbelievable to our own ears. Yet, the evidence was undeniable: the destroyed campsite, the claw marks, and, most convincingly, the charred patch of earth where the flare had ignited the creature's fur. The official story, hastily concocted by authorities eager to avoid panic, blamed the attack on a rabid bear. But those of us who knew the truth couldn't shake the memory of what we'd seen, a creature that defied explanation, a monster straight out of legend. I found myself unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares of glowing yellow eyes and razor-sharp claws. The forest, once my sanctuary, now loomed ominously at the edge of town, a dark reminder of the horrors it concealed. A week after the incident, I received a visit from a man who introduced himself as Dr. Elena Reeves a cryptozoologist from a nearby university. She had heard rumors of our encounter and was eager to learn more. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement, "I've been studying reports of unusual creatures in this region for years. Your experience could be the key to proving their existence." I was skeptical at first, but as Dr. Reeves shared her research, I found myself drawn in. She had compiled dozens of accounts spanning decades, hikers who had gone missing, campers who reported strange noises in the night, and even a few grainy photographs that hinted at something large and unnatural moving through the trees. "What do you think it is?" I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me since that terrifying night. Dr. Reeves hesitated before answering. "There are legends in these parts," she said slowly, "of creatures known as skinwalkers, shapeshifters that can take on animal characteristics. Native American lore speaks of them as evil witches, but I believe there might be a kernel of truth behind the myths. Perhaps a previously undiscovered species that has evolved remarkable adaptive capabilities." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but they also ignited a spark of curiosity. If such creatures truly existed, what else might be hiding in the depths of the forest? Over the next few months, I found myself accompanying Dr. Reeves on expeditions into the Whispering Pines. We set up camera traps, collected hair and scat samples, and interviewed locals about their own unusual experiences. Mike joined us occasionally, driven by a need to understand what had happened to his friend. Our forays into the forest were tense affairs. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on edge, our hands never far from our weapons. We never encountered anything as dramatic as that first night, but there were moments, fleeting glimpses of movement just at the edge of our vision, or the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes that convinced me we were on the right track. As winter settled over Pinewood Grove, blanketing the forest in snow, our expeditions became less frequent, but my obsession only grew. I spent long nights poring over Dr. Reeves's research, trying to piece together the puzzle of what we had encountered. It was on one such night, as a blizzard raged outside my window, that I had a breakthrough. Comparing our findings with historical accounts and geographical data, I noticed a pattern. The sightings and encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas, following a cyclic pattern that coincided with changes in the local ecosystem. Excited by my discovery, I called Dr. Reeves. Despite the late hour and the weather, she agreed to meet me at her lab on the university campus. As I drove through the deserted streets, snow swirling in my headlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Twice, I caught glimpses of movement in my rearview mirror, a dark shape that seemed to be following my car. I arrived at the lab, my heart pounding. Dr. Reeves was already there, her eyes widening as I burst through the door, covered in snow. "Alex, what's wrong?" she asked, taking in my agitated state. "I think I'm onto something," I said, brushing snow from my coat, "but I also think I was followed here." We spent the next hour going over my findings. Dr. Reeves grew increasingly excited as she saw the patterns emerging from the data. "This is incredible, Alex," she said, her voice filled with awe. "If we're right about this, it could revolutionize our understanding of cryptid behavior and evolution." Our discussion was interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere in the building. We froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "It's probably just the wind," Dr. Reeves said, but her voice lacked conviction. Another crash, closer this time, followed by the sound of shattering glass. My hand went to the hunting knife I now carried at all times. "We need to get out of here," I said, moving toward the door. But it was too late. The lab door burst open, and there, in the doorway, stood a nightmare made flesh. It was similar to the creature we had encountered in the forest but larger, its fur streaked with gray, its yellow eyes fixed on us with terrifying intelligence. What happened next was a blur of action and terror. Dr. Reeves and I fought desperately, using whatever we could grab as weapons, fire extinguishers, chairs, even caustic chemicals from the lab benches. The creature was incredibly strong and fast, but we had the advantage of numbers and desperation. In the end, it was a lucky strike with a broken microscope stand that brought the beast down. As it lay twitching on the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around its neck was a crudely fashioned necklace made of what looked like human teeth. The authorities arrived soon after, alerted by the university's security system. Once again, we found ourselves trying to explain the unexplainable, but this time, we had irrefutable proof. The creature's body, preserved by the cold, lay as evidence of the terrifying reality we had uncovered. In the months that followed, our discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The existence of the creatures, which came to be known as *Pinus hominids* in scientific circles, was hotly debated and studied. The Whispering Pines National Forest became a hotbed of research activity, with teams from around the world converging to study this new species. For my part, I found myself thrust into the role of reluctant expert. My experiences, combined with my knowledge of the local terrain, made me an invaluable asset to the research teams. Dr. Reeves and I co-authored several papers, our work laying the foundation for an entirely new field of study. But even as the world marveled at the discovery, I couldn't shake a deep sense of unease. The creature that had attacked us in the lab had worn a necklace of human teeth, a clear sign of intelligence and culture. How many more of them were out there? And what would the consequences be of revealing their existence to the world? As I stand here now, looking out over the familiar peaks of the Whispering Pines, I'm struck by how much has changed. The forest that was once my peaceful refuge is now a place of mystery and danger, its secrets only beginning to be unraveled. The scars from that night in the lab have healed, but the memories remain vivid. I know now that the world is a far stranger and more terrifying place than I ever imagined, but it's also filled with wonders beyond belief. As the sun sets, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I hear a distant howl echoing through the valleys. It's a sound that would once have filled me with terror. Now, it fills me with a complex mix of fear, excitement, and curiosity. The truth is out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, and I, *Alex Hartley **, once a simple hunter, now find myself on the greatest hunt of all, the search for understanding in a world where legends come to life. The Whispering Pines keep their secrets close, but we're listening now. And slowly, story by story, discovery by discovery, we're learning to understand the whispers. As I sit here recounting the events of that fateful night, I can't help but reflect on the journey that led me to that moment. My name is *Sarah *, and I'm what some might call a non-traditional student. At 35, with 2 children and a loving husband, I decided to pursue my lifelong dream of becoming a nurse. The decision wasn't easy. Balancing family life, work, and studies is a challenge that often feels insurmountable. But there I was, driving home after an evening class midterm, my mind still buzzing with medical terminologies and procedures we'd covered in the exam. The night was crisp, a typical autumn evening in our small Midwestern town. The roads were nearly empty, save for the occasional passing car. I'd taken this route countless times, but tonight, something felt different. The air seemed charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. As I approached the intersection on Willow Creek Road, a rarely used stretch that cut through dense woods, I began to slow down. It was then that I noticed something unusual in the sky to my right. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, I was tired from the exam and the late hour. But as I focused, I realized what I was seeing was real. 2 moving lights, approximately 300 feet above the ground. These weren't your typical aircraft lights. They moved with a fluidity that defied explanation, slowly traversing the night sky like celestial dancers. As I watched, transfixed, the lights came to a stop about 150 feet directly in front of my car. I remember thinking, this can't be happening, but it was. And what happened next only added to the surreal nature of the experience. 3 more lights appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. One by one, they lined up with the other 2, forming a perfect row of 5 illuminated objects, hovering silently above the road. Instinctively, I stopped the car. My heart was racing, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through my veins. I reached over and locked the doors, though in retrospect, I'm not sure what protection I thought that would offer against whatever was happening in the sky above me. Time seemed to stand still as I sat there, my eyes glued to the otherworldly display above. The lights hovered completely motionless, yet somehow alive with energy. I couldn't tell if they were blinking or rotating. It was as if they were part of a round object, spinning in place. The silence was the most unnerving part. Living in a rural area, I was used to the quiet of night, but this was different. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the world, leaving nothing but these 5 mysterious lights and me. I don't know how long I sat there, mesmerized by the sight. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when the lights finally moved, it happened so fast I almost missed it. One by one, they took off at a speed I've never seen before or since. Each light followed the other in perfect formation, streaking across the sky faster than any aircraft I'd ever encountered. In a matter of seconds, they were gone, leaving me alone on the dark, empty road. As the last light disappeared from view, I felt a wave of disorientation wash over me. I reached for the key to start the car, only to realize it was already running. Stranger still, I noticed the doors were unlocked. I frowned, trying to remember if I had unlocked them, but my memory was hazy, clouded by the adrenaline and excitement of what I'd just witnessed. I chalked it up to a lapse in attention. After all, I'd just experienced something extraordinary. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with questions, theories, and doubts. Had I really seen what I thought I saw, or was my tired brain playing elaborate tricks on me? As I pulled into our driveway, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 11:45 p.m. I did a double take, sure there must be some mistake. I'd left the college just after 8:30 p.m., and the drive home usually took no more than 20 minutes. I walked into the house, expecting to find my husband, Tom, already in bed. Instead, he was pacing in the living room, a worried expression etched on his face. "Sarah," he exclaimed as I entered, "where have you been? I've been trying to call you for hours." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? I left right after the exam. I should be early, if anything." Tom's frown deepened. "Early? Sarah, it's almost midnight. You're nearly 3 hours late." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Asterisk 3 hours. Asterisk how was that possible? I recounted my drive home, the strange lights in the sky, but even as I spoke, I knew it couldn't account for all that lost time. Tom listened patiently, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism. When I finished, he gently suggested that perhaps I'd dozed off in the car, my mind creating an elaborate dream to fill the gap. But I knew what I'd seen. The lights, the silence, the impossible speed, it had all been real. Hadn't it? In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessed with finding an explanation for what had happened that night. I scoured local news reports, hoping to find some mention of unusual lights in the sky. I even reached out to the local air traffic control, asking if they'd recorded any strange phenomena. My search yielded nothing concrete. A few people reported seeing something odd in the sky that night, but their accounts were vague and inconsistent. The more I dug, the more questions I had. And the more I realized that some mysteries, like the lights on Willow Creek Road, might never be fully explained. I uncovered more questions than answers. What were those lights? Why couldn't I account for those missing hours? And why did I have such a vivid memory of an event that seemingly lasted only a few minutes? My studies at nursing school took a backseat to my new obsession. I spent countless hours researching UFO sightings, abduction stories, and scientific explanations for seemingly paranormal events. Some of what I found resonated with my experience, while other accounts seemed far-fetched, even compared to what I'd witnessed. Tom tried to be supportive, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He gently suggested that perhaps I should talk to someone, a therapist or counselor, who could help me process what had happened. But I was adamant. I knew what I'd seen, and I was determined to find out the truth. It was during one of my late-night internet searches that I stumbled upon a local support group for people who had experienced unexplained phenomena. At first, I was skeptical. The idea of sitting in a circle, sharing stories that most people would dismiss as fantasy or delusion, didn't appeal to me. But as the weeks passed and my obsession grew, I found myself drawn to the idea of talking to others who might understand, people who wouldn't look at me with pity or concern when I recounted my story. The first meeting was held in the basement of a local church. As I walked down the stairs, I could hear the low murmur of voices. I paused at the door, suddenly unsure. Was I really going to do this? Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. There were about a dozen people seated in a circle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and understanding. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair stood up. "Welcome," she said warmly. "I'm Linda. We're glad you could join us. Would you like to introduce yourself?" I hesitated for a moment before taking a seat. "I'm Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I saw something I can't explain." As I recounted my story to the group, I was struck by the attentiveness on their faces. There was no judgment, no skepticism, just genuine interest and empathy. When I finished, a man named David leaned forward. "The lights you saw," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "were they a sort of pulsating blue-white?" I nodded, stunned. "Yes, exactly like that." "How did you know?" David's story was remarkably similar to mine. He'd seen the lights while camping in the woods about 50 miles from where I'd had my encounter. Like me, he'd experienced missing time and a sense of disorientation afterward. Others in the group shared their own experiences. While the details varied, there were common threads: unexplained lights, missing time, and a profound sense that something life-changing had occurred. For the first time since that night, I felt a sense of validation. These people believed me because they'd lived through similar experiences. They understood the frustration of not having answers, the feeling of being dismissed by friends and family who couldn't comprehend what we'd been through. As the meeting drew to a close, Linda approached me. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. I thought for a moment before answering. "Relieved," I said finally. "And less alone." Linda nodded understandingly. "That's why we're here. To remind each other that we're not crazy and we're not alone." Emboldened by my experience with the support group, I decided to take my investigation to the next level. With the help of David and a few others from the group, we began to piece together a timeline of sightings in our area. We created a map, marking each location where strange lights had been reported. As we worked, a pattern began to emerge. The sightings seemed to follow a rough line, moving from the southwest to the northeast over the course of several months. Our investigation didn't stop there. We reached out to local astronomers, meteorologists, and even military officials, seeking any explanation for what we'd seen. Most were dismissive, offering explanations ranging from weather balloons to experimental aircraft. But a few were more open-minded. An astronomy professor from the local university agreed to meet with us. While he couldn't offer a definitive explanation, he did provide us with tools to better document any future sightings. Armed with this new knowledge, we set up a network of observers. If anyone in the group spotted anything unusual, they were to contact the others immediately. We were determined to gather concrete evidence of whatever it was we'd encountered. Months passed, and while our enthusiasm never waned, the sightings became less frequent. Life began to return to normal. I refocused on my nursing studies, determined to complete my degree despite the distractions of the past year. It was a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my initial encounter, when it happened again. I was driving home from a late-night study session at the library when I saw them, the familiar blue-white lights, hovering in the distance. My heart raced as I pulled over to the side of the road. With shaking hands. It was a crisp autumn morning, much like the one when I first saw the lights. My father, an avid outdoorsman, had organized a horseback riding trip through the Whispering Pines National Forest. I was thrilled. It was my first time joining him on one of his adventures, and I was eager to prove I could keep up with the seasoned riders. The group consisted of my father, his two closest friends, and me. We set out early, the horses' hooves crunching through the frost-covered leaves as we made our way deeper into the forest. The morning passed uneventfully. We rode through dense stands of pine and oak, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. My father pointed out animal tracks and bird calls, sharing his vast knowledge of the wilderness with me. I felt a deep sense of connection to him and to the natural world around us. It was around midday when things took a strange turn. We had stopped to rest near a small stream, letting the horses drink while we ate our packed lunches. As we sat there, I noticed a peculiar stillness in the air. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustle of leaves in the wind seemed to fade away. My father and his friends were deep in conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the trees just beyond the stream. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but as I focused, I realized it was something else entirely. A figure, tall and slender, stood partially hidden behind a tree. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, large and black, seemed to glint in the dappled sunlight. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to look away. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't hear me at first, so I reached out and tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, look." He turned, following my gaze, but by then, the figure was gone. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. I thought I saw something," I stammered, suddenly unsure of myself. My father exchanged a glance with his friends, and one of them chuckled. "Probably just a trick of the light," he said, brushing it off. "These woods can play tricks on you if you're not used to them." I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen something real, but the moment had passed. My father gave me a reassuring smile and suggested we continue our ride. Reluctantly, I mounted my horse and followed the group, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. I tried to rationalize it, maybe it was a trick of the light, as my father's friend had suggested, or perhaps I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. It was my first encounter with the unexplained, and it planted a seed of curiosity in me that would grow over the years. Years later, when I saw the lights on Willow Creek Road, that memory came rushing back. The figure in the woods, the stillness in the air, the sense of being watched, it all felt connected, as if the forest itself was trying to tell me something. And now, as I reflect on both experiences, I realize that they've shaped me in ways I'm still trying to understand. They've taught me to keep an open mind, to question the world around me, and to embrace the mystery that lies just beyond the edges of what we think we know. The forest, the lights, the figure, they're all part of a larger story, one that I may never fully understand. But that's okay. Sometimes, the journey is more important than the destination. And as I continue to navigate the twists and turns of my life, I carry those experiences with me, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we often give it credit for. The ride back to our campsite was silent, the weight of what I'd just witnessed pressing down on me like a physical force. My father kept glancing at me, his expression a mix of concern and something else, disbelief, maybe, or frustration. He didn't ask me any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I wasn't sure I could put what I'd seen into words, and even if I could, I doubted he'd believe me. After all, the rangers and officers had already dismissed it as a bear attack. How could I expect my father to see it any differently? When we got back to our camp, his friends were sitting around the fire, their laughter and conversation cutting through the night air. They fell silent as we approached, their eyes flicking between me and my father. "Everything okay?" one of them asked, his tone cautious. "Bear attack," my father said curtly, his voice tight. "Sarah's fine, but the other group lost someone." The men exchanged uneasy glances but didn't press further. I sat down by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to process what had happened. The image of the creature, its skeletal deer head, its clawed hands, the way it had moved, was burned into my mind. And Keith, his body, the bites, the way he'd been dragged into the woods like prey. It wasn't a bear. It couldn't have been. My father sat down beside me, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the events of the night. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded, still staring into the fire. "Yeah, just shaken up." He hesitated, then put an arm around my shoulders. It was an uncharacteristic gesture, one that caught me off guard. "You did good tonight," he said. "Staying calm, helping out." That's not easy. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded again. The rest of the night passed in a blur. My father's friends tried to lighten the mood with stories and jokes, but the tension never fully lifted. I barely slept, my mind replaying the events over and over again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes, heard its unearthly shriek. The next morning, we packed up camp early. No one wanted to stay any longer than necessary. As we rode back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, once so beautiful and inviting, now felt oppressive, its shadows hiding things I didn't want to see. When we got back to the parking lot, my father pulled me aside. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "What happened out there, it's not something we talk about, okay? Not to anyone. People won't understand, and it'll just cause trouble." I wanted to argue, to tell him that what I'd seen was real, that it wasn't a bear, that it was something far worse. But the look in his eyes stopped me. He was scared, not just for me, but of what I might say. So I nodded, swallowing my protests. "Okay," I said. "I won't talk about it." He gave me a tight smile and clapped me on the shoulder. "Good. Let's get home." The drive back was quiet. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it some kind of animal? A hallucination? Or something else entirely? I didn't have any answers, only questions. When we got home, I went straight to my room and pulled out my laptop. I spent hours searching for anything that might explain what I'd seen, cryptid sightings, local legends, anything. That's when I stumbled upon stories about the Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore. The descriptions matched what I'd seen: tall, skeletal, with antlers and glowing eyes. It was said to be a malevolent spirit, a cannibalistic monster that stalked the wilderness. I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but another part couldn't ignore the similarities. Whatever it was real. I'd seen it with my own eyes. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. The memory of that night haunted me, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced the creature was outside my window. My grades slipped, and I became withdrawn, avoiding my friends and spending most of my time alone. My father noticed, of course. He tried to talk to me a few times, but I shut him out. How could I explain what I was feeling when he didn't even believe what I'd seen? Eventually, he stopped trying, and we settled into an uneasy silence. It wasn't until years later, after I'd moved out and started my own life, that I finally began to come to terms with what had happened. I never found any concrete answers, but I learned to live with the uncertainty. The forest, the creature, the fear, they became a part of me, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we often realize. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder if the creature is still out there, lurking in the shadows of the whispering pines, waiting for its next victim. I hope not. But deep down, I know the truth. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.